Yeah, I think that's fine.
I don't remember how much stuff's in it, so I'll trust you guys on that. You would have two parallel properties instead of make this one null and set the other one.
Actually, if I was going to make one of these properties null, I'd make HTTP request message null, because I guess I could imagine some world where we are speculatively creating new connections without actually having a request that we immediately want to send over it. But I don't know if that matters.
That would break making it extensible though, because then you would need somebody to pass something from the caller that wasn't like just the endpoint. Otherwise, you're kind of forced to store a map somewhere else from endpoint to like state.
I mean, it would be the kind of thing where we'd say, don't do X and Y together because they won't work.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I think we've painted this bike shed enough.
Can we just formalize? So I think we agreed on a context class. Can we just formalize the API that we landed on?
Totally. Let me just paste this in what I have right now.
Oh my God, we're 27 minutes in and the UI is still updating.
Emo, do you have your new computer yet?
I do not. And unfortunately, I was streaming it for 80 apparently, so I just had to restart the stream at 1080, so maybe that's why.
Oh no.
So who knows?
Yeah, because I saw the stream go down just a minute ago.
So I just pasted it in. So
the func on sockets HTTP handler should be get set property.
Oh, sorry.
And
yes,
I would personally remove handler from the name of the connection context class. Sockets HTTP to me is sufficient.
Yeah, I can review that too.
Do we want to make the connection context sealed?
I'm personally a fan of that. Jeremy might have different opinions on that.
We can always,
that depends if you want my opinion or what the book says.
You wrote the book, is that not the same? Are you saying you have cognitive dissonance of your own book?
As far as I know, 100% of the people whose names are on the cover of the book disagree with the rule that classes should be unsealed by default. But
yeah,
Anders believes classes should be unsealed by default, and he wrote the language, so he won.
This is so. Normally, I would say that context classes should be sealed by default, but this is really a POCO more than anything else. And if it's a POCO, just leave it unsealed.
I mean, there's not really like nothing on its virtual, so you're not going to get a devirtualization benefit. No one should really be able to pass this in somewhere, but maybe someone wants to extend it for mocking reasons, and I don't see a reason to hurt them. Like, going back to what the rule says, it's if you want to seal something, you should have a reason, and I don't see what the reason would be here.
Yeah, but going from what we generally say in API review, it's seal by default, and if enough users request it, we can always unseal it, because extensibility should generally be part of the design.
Yes, well, and that's why methods are non-virtual by default.
Ugh, makes me sick to my stomach.
Well, we
are not
API review. We do not say seal it by default unless it's very complicated things. Complicated things that we think someone inheriting may in fact break things, we seal, but or if it has other complicated consequences, but we definitely say non-virtual unless you need it, but sealed is a word that we generally don't recommend because Anders doesn't like it when we recommend it.
Do we need the properties to be get set, or can they just be get on the context?
At that point, it doesn't make sense to leave it unsealed because no one could ever instantiate this thing with any reasonable effect.
True. I mean, I guess we can leave it open for mocking.
I mean,
if it's virtual.
I mean, I would say if you make it get only, then you have to have a constructor on it, and then you have the same problem as before. Then we just add more constructors over time, which seems not
well,
very
the
useful.
constructor in this case would be internal.
Yeah, if you go with an
But
internal
if
only
we want to
constructor,
enable
yes.
mocking, then yeah, I agree. We'd need constructors or just leave it get set.
I mean, if you believe our lives is easier by just removing the setters and having an internal constructor, I'm fine with that too. And then we can seal the type, in my opinion, as well, because then there's no point.
Right. Well, if we have a sealed type that is non-constructible, then certainly mocking is hurt at that point. Do we have a init in the languages that we're using in 5?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just trolling chat right now.
Fair enough.
I don't, to be honest, I don't really see anyone mocking this because nothing's virtual, but I'm also like biased toward mock you as a framework, so ignore what I'm saying.
I mean, this would just be that they're testing their callback, right?
Yeah, but I mean, mocking at this point would literally just be instantiated and set the properties, right? It's not mocking in the sense that, you know, you're not trying to replace things or replace behaviors.
Right, yeah. But if the public API looked like this but without the sets, I guess you'd have to declare the internal constructor, or it would be default constructible still. But like, if there's no way you can provide those values, then you wouldn't ever be able to test your thing without reflection.
Yeah. Which clearly we don't want to force people to do.
And I don't see why there would be a benefit to making the constructor internal.
We should have init support in C#9. It's available in SharpLab, provided is external init is defined in compiler services.
Make it public. Oh, just make it public. Unsealed.
Yeah.
Make sure you can do it up.
Unsealed Poco, like, yeah.
That's what I just had the design that I have. Like, to me, like things like this that are just effectively just parameters, there really isn't a lot of value in sealing. Because to me, the value in sealing is, as Jeremy indicated earlier, is like when you have a polymorphic class hierarchy with virtuals, that's something where you don't want to support like arbitrary extension points early on because it gets super easy. It's super hard. This one is literally just a glorified property bag with strong typing. So like I don't care whether somebody adds something to it.
Do you have a question, Carol?
Yeah, I would like to get back to the name, the sockets HTTP connection context. I think it's a little bit confusing to me, you know, because the sockets here represents the sockets HTTP handler. I don't think we're gonna use it in any other context than of the context of sockets HTTP handler. So leaving out the handler part, it's kind of weird for me. Anyway, okay. I would like to open it up to discussion.
Yeah, it's not that I think there's reuse, it's just that socket HTTP is specific enough that we can just make the type name slightly shorter because it's already quite a mouthful. But yeah, I would not expect this type to be used anywhere else.
With systemnet connections, we had a sockets HTTP connection factory, so we didn't use handler there either.
Okay.
Also, so I don't know which this argues for, but I don't think anyone is going to type this name. They're literally going to, you know, type in a lambda that says, you know, context, comma, cancellation token. And so, like, using the actual type name here would be pretty rare for a user.
I mean, you're assuming that people use lambdas for all their things and not named functions that they delegate to.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, though, like once you type that, like I mean, to me, handler or non-handler here doesn't make a huge difference. It's just, I have a personal threshold of like 30 characters per type or something.
Yeah, I just felt that the handler was redundant with, because once you have the HTTP, there's only one thing that it really goes with. It's the HTTP is important to make sure it doesn't seem like it's applying to sockets, but then the handler felt redundant to me.
Would we ever consider using a nested class here? Is that something we do for API like this?
We generally
not very pretty because users have to type an even longer name in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah, now you have socket HTTP handler dot context rather than socket HTTP handler connection context, right? Or
yeah, our general expectation is if someone's going to have to ever type it or possibly ever type it, then it should not be nested. But things like using a custom enumerator from get enumerator, they probably just slapped it in a for each, and the type name never even showed up on their screen.
Yep.
So then, are you okay with socket HTTP connection context, or should we rename it to include the handler name?
I would prefer the handler name, to be honest with you, but I don't have a strong opinion.
Okay, that is 2 votes for having it, and
I'm fine with either, based on Corey's, thing that we use the factory as well with HTTP factory only.
I mean, it's not shipping. We can rename that still.
I think I would prefer without handler. I agree that it's redundant unless we plan to introduce a sockets HTTP handler 2 or something and not use it there.
I have both opinions and therefore abstain.
Yeah.
all right, then I do what's easiest for me, and just leave it with the one that already is in the chat or in the thing. All right, anything else, or is that it? Does this list anything? Did we say anything else that I should add to the bullet points?
Did we agree on leaving the get set in there on the connection callback, connect callback?
Yeah, it helps testability. Nobody has any real if you get one and you set it to null inside your own callback, you only hurt yourself. So the only penalty that you would get from having the setter be public is that you can't reuse the objects across multiple calls, but yep, can't reuse the objects across multiple calls. So
yeah.
So I think it's good as is.
Should we use init instead of set? I can't imagine why you would want to set those multiple times.
I don't know if we would want to use a new language feature this close to shipping, to be honest.
Yeah, and again, testing, you could just be a big for each, set the thing, call the thing, set the thing, call the thing. Why make them type new again?
Yeah. I'm generally not a fan of using language features unless we really know the language feature and the limitations that it has.
Yeah, I see us using it maybe in future APIs, but after we've gotten a better feel for it, like Emma said.
That's fine.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, so then
I think it makes more sense as input objects, and this is just kind of this is a delegate extension point object. It's not really. There's no real state to it, so who cares?
If those properties are not nullable, it's going to be default initted to null though here.
Right.
Is this valid? Are we doing something bad there?
How do we do this normally with POCOs? Are we declaring them all as nullable?
I think POCOs tend not to use nullable annotations, do they?
We used them everywhere in the BCL now.
Yeah.
We don't have POCOs in the BCL, do we, for the most part?
We do. I'm thinking key value pair, for example, tuples.
Key value pair is not really a POCO. I'm pretty sure it has a constructor on it.
Are they read-only?
That's a good question.
I guess probably because, as you said, we have a constructor.
It is a read-only struct, yes.
Okay, never mind then. Well, and then tuple, you get to set the nullability because you control the types.
Yep.
But yeah, tuple is a good example of a POCO, yeah. Old value tuple, I guess.
Yeah, I guess in our case, most of the stuff happens to be read-only, right? Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, actually. Because, making them nullable will kind of suck, because not everybody who just handles the stuff now gets warnings unless they do something about it. And realistically, they should never, ever receive a null.
It could mean that we
just add a constructor.
Yeah, just add a public constructor with non-nullable things, and then they would have to use bangs to get nulls in there.
Yeah.
Then if we're adding a constructor, do we really need the setters now?
Yeah, at that point, I would go
No,
all
we
the way.
don't. Yeah.
And if we ever want to, so
Nullability.
presumably the reason we're doing this is because we also want to add properties in the future, which means we would need to make those properties nullable, maybe.
Unless they're calculable from other things, but yeah.
Interesting rabbit hole going down.
Or if you just say, fuck it, you don't get
It's
a
almost
constructor.
easier to make it sealed.
I think at this point, I'm honestly at the point where just make them get only and then not have a public constructor. Because I mean, it seems weird to me that we can, now if we add another property, like we can't technically make it nullable now, or non-nullable anymore, because if somebody called the other constructor, it would be null. Like, what's the point then?
Okay. I mean, again, I'll say that the consequence of that is no one can test their callback.
Yeah, the way that you would test it is you would have your callback deconstruct the context and call a helper method, and you'd unit test that helper method.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I mean, and yes, that kind of defeats some of the value of
Sucks,
having
but-
this, but like, yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like that is user code and they version at their own pace, so that seems fine.
Okay. I'm like, that's
I don't know if this
just raising the
should
point.
affect the decision, but HTTP client is already annoying for people to mock. Maybe making it more annoying isn't great, but since this is a super advanced API, will probably be fine.
I mean, hypothetically speaking, like even if we make this thing public and everything is settable, how much of a pain in the ass is it to mock this particular scenario? Like if I already have to write 100 lines of code, then extracting that to a helper method is not going to make my life more miserable.
Yeah,
at that point,
I
it's a
think
drop
it's
in the bucket.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, so that means for the API, or for purposes of API, we declare it to have a private zero argument constructor. That's what the ref CS will say.
Yes.
Yes.
And then the properties are get only.
Since we're doing this, should we just go all the way and seal the class?
Yeah, I just have that in my
Yeah.
local one. Well, because once you have a constructor that's private, you're effectively sealed anyway.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, that is unfortunate. Which I guess at this point would mean that in the future, when we build types like this, I think init would solve that problem, right?
Wait,
Just
is
need to
there
know how init works there.
Is there a public constructor, or can you not create this thing anymore?
You cannot.
What the fuck?
Yeah,
Okay.
so add the
Why?
private. The private socket HTTP connection context paren.
Why wouldn't it be public?
To your question, it has too many weird implications for extensibility if we were to try to make everything public.
For doing it before, for adding more properties to it.
Yeah. Because now all those properties would have to be nullable, and it makes consuming this thing a pain in the ass. And it's already unit testable in the sense that if you want to unit test your function, decompose your function and unit test the decomposed version.
Yeah, that's the downside of nullable annotations, right? Because if the problem is if you have a public get set or effectively a constructor version, it doesn't really matter. The question is now if somebody calls the older constructor that didn't set it, then it must be nullable, right? And so that is not great for consumers. And since most of the people will just consume it, we don't want them to have to check for null for things that will never be null. That seems backwards. But like that's what I'm saying. I think in the future, probably what we would do is we would basically go back to, we don't have a constructor. We just have get and init, and then say, well, you're supposed to initialize this thing. Like, and if you don't, then too bad.
But
Yeah,
doesn't that break people? Like if I've written code that there's two properties today. I write code that inits those two properties. Now in the next release, we add a third property that is get init, and is that going to fail to compile because now there's a new property I'm supposed to init?
Yeah, you're right. That
Maybe.
doesn't work this way.
Yeah, I think this is one of those nullability has introduced breaking change concepts that we have to decide how we feel about.
I mean, that seems almost like we need a new concept. It's like, you should initialize this basically, right? Because I don't know. To me, marking all these new things nullable, that seems maybe okay in version 1, but if you're in version 4 and you look back, and now 75% of the new additions are all nullable just because you did them after v1, that would suck, right? So like, I think we would have to think about how we want to model this. I could imagine like we just basically go with get init, and then we add a new custom attribute that says, well, if you initialize this type, you will initialize this thing as well, and then people would just get warnings for the v1 code where they don't initialize things and says, well, you should initialize this thing, you haven't, so it's null. But yeah.
Well, I mean, you would still have a problem of anybody who built against an older ref assembly wouldn't even be capable of assigning the properties. So
yeah, that's true. But like, I mean, you just pick your.
It's more of when if it's an output object, which this sort of is. It's an output of the HTTP handler class into the callback. Like the only people who really build this in real code is us, and we promise they're never null. But if you build them in your test, then they might be null, and if you build them on your own for some weird reason, they might be null. Like, we just need to figure out what that means as far as nullability annotations and breaking changes. But
yeah, I mean, it just
right now we're
saddens
taking
me.
a conservative position. So.
Yeah, it just saddens me that effectively the outcome of this is that POCUS don't work, right? But it seems like we can't version POCUS over time with nullable in a sane way. All right, I think we discussed this to death now. Levi, I think you marked this one here,
Thanks.
right? Absolutely.
Yeah, I marked it just because when we obsoleted thread.abort, we also forgot to obsolete reset abort. My suggestion is we just use the same obsolation code that we did with abort.
Yeah,
Reset abort always throws PNSE.
Yeah, we should do that. I thought we did. I mean, recently, I think we had a discussion on this, no?
We talked about various overloads of abort, but I don't remember reset abort ever coming up. If it did come up, it was just an oversight that we forgot to mark it.
I don't think I even knew there was a reset abort.
I was about to say, like, how does this even work? You catch it and then you call reset. I don't understand. Like, when can I call this?
Well, so the idea is that you would catch thread abort exception, and then within that you would call thread.resetAbort. Like this is how ASP.NET works, for instance, when it's canceling requests, or ASP.NET full framework.
Old ASP.NET.
Yeah, full framework.
Are there?
But yeah.
Are there any? So you just said that this throws PNSE on every platform.
Every core platform, yes.
Every core platform. What's
it works on full framework.
Right, but in the context of net core app like 3.1 and up, is there any reason, given APIs that always throw PNSE on .NET Core for like net 3 on up, shouldn't they just all be obsolete?
Yeah, and that is kind of what we were doing with a lot of the obsoletions that were introduced in 3.1, or I'm sorry, in 5.0. We were trying to be a little judicious in what we obsoleted in 5.0, but we are kind of on a tear to annotate every single one of those APIs with stop calling me. In 5.0, we obsoleted thread.abort, so it would make sense that this should have been in that same slot. We just forgot about it.
Is there a comprehensive list? Like, do we know?
There is.
Because we know like Emos tooling can tell us if things are not supported. Like, do we have a list of like these methods are worthless?
Yes, I'll paste that in chat for you. We actually started keeping a list of everything that was newly obsoleted in 5.0.
Do we have a list of things which are not useful because they always throw PNSE on core, and their current obsolete status?
I don't think such a list exists, but it should be relatively straightforward to build a tool that can find that.
Yeah, I can improve the tooling. Like the problem is I can only look at one implementation at a time, right? So I can't tell easily whether all implementations throw. So I just index all builds, and then if they all say they throw, then it's easier, I think. Okay. The other thing is the tool is very liberal, right? Because our throw patterns in the BCL are batshit crazy, so I don't just check whether the body is just throw new platform not supported exception. It's more like, well, you call some helper method and that one returns an exception, and then the call set does the throw and all of that bullshit, and so that can sometimes return in false positive. So maybe I need some sort of like, no, I know for a fact this always throws because there's no other code around it. But that's usually not how we encode it. So it seems like, regardless of this one, I think we're all in agreement that even so, this is post 5.0, right? So this is for 6.0. So we are okay with adding a new obsolescence with an existing diagnostic ID, which I'm very much in favor of.
I was going to ask that question because this is back to the good old warnings as error. That means that you upgrade from 5 to 6. Now an error that you've already dealt with is manifesting elsewhere. And if we're okay with that, that's fine. I just know that, especially since Jared's on the call now, that's historically been why obsolete was hard.
So, well, at the same time, though, it was also the reason why it was hard is because upgrading your tool set was indistinguishable from like upgrading what you were targeting. So basically, because Visual Studio, you install a new Visual Studio, you implicitly move to C# latest. But now, because of how TFM and reference assemblies work, like if I install .NET 6x SDK, with the exception of your ifdefs, it doesn't change it doesn't change the reference assemblies you're using. It doesn't change the warning level. It doesn't change the language version. So installing the SDK is no longer the thing that gives you new information. It's when you change your TFM. That's when the information and warnings change, which we have at least been on the belief that because that's an explicit user action, it's okay to attach some cost to it.
Yeah, and so the reason why I think using an existing diagnostic makes sense is that if you already handled that if you already handled that diagnostic ID before and you decided you don't care, it's actually beneficial to reuse the existing one, because you're just saying, if you already decided you don't care, then you still don't care because it's the same sort of obsolescence, right? So I think that makes sense.
That's if you warned it.
Well, if you warned it, or if you just the editor config setting for syslib 006, right? There's multiple ways you can suppress it globally.
But that's if you turned off the diagnostic instead of mitigated it in your 3 calls or whatever.
Right. So, but that's what I'm saying. Like if you decided you don't care, then it still makes sense to use the existing one. If you decided you do care and you wrote custom code to handle that, well, then we tell you that, oh, you're missing this case over here. And so in that sense, I think it's actually useful to reuse the existing one, because you tell the customer, okay, here's a new thing that we forgot about.
Fair enough. I'm just making sure we considered the question instead of just doing things.
No, it's a good question. I've at least our processes internally, traditionally we've had a list of obsolescence that were safe, or I'm sorry, a list of warnings that were generally safe to ignore, and a list of warnings that you had to go through other people and kind of get their sign off before you suppress them. If you as a developer have already said this particular warning is safe to ignore, as opposed to something that has real world impact on an application, then reusing that would allow you to use whatever existing sign-off processes you have, rather than have to go set up a new, let's analyze this particular warning code for anything that might be of consequence to us, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it does potentially force people to react, but the reaction should be a little easier if we're reusing an existing code.
Okay.
All right.
But along those lines, if we were ever to obsolete new thread, for instance, and tell people you should be using the thread pool for absolutely everything, I would use a different code for that, because it's manifestly different than the concept of aborting a running thread.
So this is what it looks like, right?
Yes. We we would literally just copy and paste whatever.
Yeah,
the
whatever
message
is
is.
above. It's like it's
Yeah.
no the. I mean, I'm pretty sure we already have a URL there as well, but I don't care.
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah. And our existing guidance would still be appropriate even for this API.
Yep, makes sense. All right.
We need to update all those FW links. Haha.
Have we actually done anything yet? Because I think every time I try the FW link, they go nowhere. We still have to set up the actual pages, right?
I have all of them registered. They just don't really link anywhere right now because we didn't have the docs up yet.
Yeah, do we have a tracking issue for those?
I'm about to make one actually.
Okay, because I was thinking like who's actually the hook for writing those
Yeah,
pages?
I mean, we all have access to them, but I created them, so I may as well update them.
Yeah, I was just thinking whether we actually have the physical pages, like the actual content yet. I mean, that's my question more or less.
Yeah, so what I was planning on doing is where the page already exists, I would link to that. Where the page doesn't exist, I would temporarily link to the GitHub issue, which has the draft documentation.
Oh, okay, cool. That works. All right, so how do I review this without killing myself now? I guess
I can put the cats back on the screen. That'll make everyone happier.
I guess this is the view is probably the best one. So I just ignore the typos. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, I guess let me do this. Let me open this in a secondary tab, walk you through the thing, and then we can go over the comments. Otherwise, it's a bit weird to jump to the comments without any context. So we talked about this last week with Christoph. I don't think Christoph is on the call today. Probably too short
So
notice.
he'd be here at 11.
All right, so then here's 3 minutes, and I can just give the rest of the people who are not here yet some context. No, the rest of the people who haven't been there last time, I can give them some context this way. So Christoph was asking for a type called binary data. So the context goes like this. So we have a lot of types in the BCL that deal with binary data. You know, of course, we have byte arrays, we also have streams, and we have spans and memories and all that. And so the problem with these kind of types is that, first of all, there's multiple, but then also that is kind of, you know, complicated by the fact that effectively it's not just about the actual data holder, it's also about the thing that you're converting from and to. And that's really where the shit hits the fan, so to speak, because we have, you know, strings, streams, potentially object graphs you want to serialize. So there's lots and lots of options where you can do lots of various paths from types you go from and to. And so the Azure SDK and the usability studies found that people want to do something simple, like they want to, let's say, queue a message in the Azure storage queue. They have a string, and then the actual underlying API takes a span of byte, and then they're like, well, I don't know how I now get a span of byte from my string. Or, you know, they have an object graph, and it's like, well, this thing takes a stream, and they're like, well, that's great. How do I get my object graph into a stream form? And so the way they solved the problem is by basically just saying, let's have a single type called binary data. And so the underlying API, instead of taking span of byte, let's say, actually takes binary data. And then when people see that in IntelliSense, they can just new up binary data. They immediately discover their constructor. So there's, you know, properties they can use to actually initialize this thing to something sensible. And then they immediately know how to use the API. So basically what I have here is I have like written up some scenarios to kind of explain what this looks like. So imagine you use Azure Storage Queues. So you have a queue client, and then what you want to do is you want to queue an item that basically says, I want to resize my image. And so the way you do this is storage queues, basically you have, I think, 4K, whatever, for a message. So you don't usually post the actual data you want to do. You post something that refers to the data that you want to process. And so you have your own custom format. In my case, I made up this, you know, resize image class, and basically that describes, I want this image in this URL resized to these resolutions, right? And then you just serialize this thing into, let's say, JSON payload, and that's what you actually store in the queue. And so with binary data, what the people would see is at the very bottom of the thing, when they actually invoke IntelliSense for send message async, they see that this thing takes binary data, and then they can say, okay, I don't know what that is. And then the usual pattern is they just try to new the type up, which they can because they have a public constructor, and then they have just instance methods on them that allows them to, for example, set the data from an object graph that is now being serialized as JSON. And then retrieving side is very similar. Like basically when you say, looks a bit different with storage queues. Usually you have a callback pattern where, every time somebody posts to the queue, they actually call you with Azure Functions and then just pass you the payload from the queue. In this case, it would just give you the payload as binary data. And then again, you can say, binary data dot, and then you find it, in this case, the instance method here to object from JSON. And then the usual pattern that we have is that you use a generic argument to actually specify what you want to deserialize it under. And then you get your stuff out, right? So that's roughly the idea of the type. Does that make sense to people?
Yep.
Cool. I think Christoph just joined. Yep. So
yes.
Then let's go to the requirements. So basically, the number one thing that we have here is we need to make it easy for people to construct from the data types that we have, which is basically byte arrays, spans, memories, string, and JSON serialized objects. We want to make it easy to convert from those bytes to the same representations back, so it should be symmetric in that sense. We do want to have a type that has opinionated defaults so that people don't have to do a lot of configuration. It should be possible for people to do that, but we're also okay with saying, if you do something super custom, that's fine. The type can already be constructed from a span or from a byte array. You do whatever you want to do, and you just give us the byte array, right? So we don't feel like we need to support every single whistle because there's always this ultimate escape hatch anyway. But basically, one of the things you want to do is you want to say, well, this thing is used in the context of a cloud platform, and so strings are usually UTF-8, and then for object serialization, we just pick whatever defaults we think make sense for the options. Because the goal really is to just get people going. It's not to allow arbitrary encodings. We don't have a goal to make this API super high performant. I mean, of course, we don't want to make it dog slow, but it's not one of those patterns where we really shoot for zero allocations, right? So if there's copying going on, that's fine. The goal here is usability, not perf. So as far as the design goes, let me just scroll down. So the biggest, I think, room of contention is, last time we already talked about this, is that basically the design that Christoph gave us. Jesus. Orange juice is really sticky. So basically the binary data that he designed basically has the JSON serialization built into it, which basically allows us to have regular constructors and regular instance methods. And so what I was toying around with was the idea that we described last time, which is basically, well, what if we don't do that? What if we basically only have regular instance methods, because that allows us to use normal extension methods. And then we just have a public constructor that you can't see here because it's a struct. And then we basically just say, look, we allow you to construct the object, or in this case, the struct, and then you just call, set bytes or set object as JSON async, and then everything else just falls out. And so I'm pretty sure there's a usability hit by doing that, but it does allow us to separate these things into two types and then also ship them as different assemblies if we ever have to. So modulo this, Christoph, are you on board with everything else that I said before?
And when you said before, what did you mean?
So I'm pretty sure you have opinions on this extension method stuff here, but like all the things I said before, the requirements, the general thing about how we anticipate the type to be used, all of that is a fair representation of what you told me.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Then, so what are your thoughts on this extension pattern?
I think it's basically a trade-off between the ability to move the type down in the dependency hierarchy and usability, this type being immutable and not having weird empty constructor that then you have to call some methods to initialize the type. So I think unless we think we want to move it to the core of the BCL, I would optimize for usability and the type being immutable.
Well, but with all the constructors, there is still the shear of things that are async. you have to use as the methods, and then there's the like, should we put the synchronous one as a constructor or just make them both be methods so that they have parity? So I think that the constructor one has more edge cases, and that the extension method, pure extension methods, while it does look a little weird, that to me it feels like it gives us a better path forward on things, and it means that we don't end up with this heavily coupled type, because it's only coupled to the things that you use the extension methods from.
I just, like we basically designed the type to be a usability type, and we usability tested it, and it looks like a regular .NET type with constructors and few conversion methods. I worry that if we start playing with some strange type that doesn't have a constructor, but it has a default one that doesn't mean anything, makes it into an empty type, and then methods to mutate the instance. We are kind of doing an experiment, and I question the goals of this experiment. This kind of refactoring, like designing for the future, that I don't know, if it ever will come. It's very risky in my opinion. I would not ship this type without usability studying it again with this design, and also I don't think we need it. I think the type with a dependency, basically being a bit high level and having dependency on our main serialization technology, is, that's what the type was designed for.
So I agree with the usability testing. So like to me that seems, I think I've said it somewhere actually it's at the very top of the screen right now. So like, yeah, I think we need to test that, and if it turns out to be a major bump, we shouldn't do it. I think the question now becomes, how do we have enough time to test that? To Jeremy's point though, what I find appealing, modulo the layering issue is also that we can handle the async and non-async in the same fashion. It kind of irks me that we can't do async with constructors, because it kind of creates this very weird dichotomy where, well, if you want to have it easy, then you don't use async, and it seems like you just ask people to move mechanics for not a lot of good reasons, in my opinion. Yes, I think there is some weirdness with the syntax, but I think after having written some sample code, I kind of convinced myself that I actually don't mind it too much. I actually think it looks fairly reasonable with the extension syntax. The immutability concern, I think, is largely mitigated by the fact that we just blow up the second time you try to set it. So people can't accidentally mutate state when they didn't intend to. But yeah, I'm curious what people do pretty much after the newing up thing, right? Whether they actually figure out that they should call some instance method, whether they're completely lost. So the question here becomes, if that were the design, and given that you told us you want to ship within 2 months, like what does it mean for your timeline?
Well, I mean, one thing is timeline, doing the usability more usability studies again, and second one is resources for the usability studies. Like I don't know how I could justify spending the resources on testing something that is a very strange design that we don't have anywhere else in the BCL. Like, do we have mutable structs because we didn't want to have a constructor, so we added extension methods on structs that mutate them? Like it violates so many of our guidelines that I don't know how I would justify the usability study.
Well, as I said, like the type wouldn't be mutable, right? It would effectively be init only. But the question is, yeah, I mean, to me, the cost justification is we try to make a type that is currently basically local to the Azure SDK. We want to make this a platform type, and there is some cost in doing that. and that would be part of the usability study.
But the type, but just to go back to your first point, the type wouldn't be read-only anymore.
It would be a init only. If you call two set methods on the same instance, it will throw on the second call. So if you passed it somewhere and they called set, expecting there's no expectation of mutability because if you succeeded in mutating it, it throws.
And you think it's a good design to we would be now creating a type that has modes and it throws from random code paths because somebody didn't call the first set or called the first set?
Well, if they didn't call any set, it would have a default state, and that would need to be dealt with no matter what because it's a struct. And then if they call any of the set methods, they just can't call a second one. So that the thing it would stop is the expectation that if you've received one that you can call set. Yes, there's a set method. It'll just literally never work. And if it did work, then your context wasn't going to work.
Yeah, so the type has modes. Now, if I pass to a method, I need to be careful to know in which mode it is because it can throw potentially.
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow entirely because yes, the type has effectively free semantics, but I mean, today the model is you get the type and you can't do anything with it, right? If you receive a binary data, you're not supposed to call any methods on it anyway, except for extracting information from it. So that hasn't changed, right? So the only party that should ever use set is the party that constructs binary data, which is localized to the code that does that.
But then instance methods will show up on the type. They will be called set. Users will be accidentally calling it and getting exceptions. Again.
But what do you mean by accidentally calling it? They would once think it looked convenient, and it'll throw an exception of this type. Set can only be called immediately after construction, and then they're
and they will get an instance already constructed, and it will be like, oh, I can also set the object. Okay, awesome. Let me try calling it.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, I would just say, I'd rather test that than ship a design that we don't feel warm and fuzzy about, right? Because that's.
I mean, I agree. Extension statics are better. Because then it's the extension static built it and the instance never looked mutable, but we don't have that, and I think that this is the best compromise we can get.
I mean, yeah, I would say that. So I would say if we had extension statics, I would make them all static factories effectively.
Yeah, I think we are now designing a different type. The type that I think Jeremy you're talking about, we already have it. Is read-only memory. Just add a bunch of extension methods on top of it, and you have this type. This type is meant to be optimized for usability, and we know that users want to just create types using constructors, look at the parameters, choose whatever they want to use to initialize it, and then have a simple type that has, is immutable, has just conversions, and it all works. I think we are adding so much complexity by playing these tricks with extension methods for everything that I think it changes what the type is and makes it super ugly.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. That's why I said, to me, that is the trade-off, right? It's the trade-off between how do we feel about the design and how do we feel about the usability. But I think one of them we can actually answer by doing tests, right?
Can somebody articulate, because I still don't understand the problem with the current design?
To me, the problem with the original design, which is this one here, is twofold. One of them is that effectively means the type needs to live at a very high level, which now also means the type has to live effectively in some assembly that doesn't exist yet, right? So you have to introduce some new assembly which now would basically only hold binary data, would depend on system.text.json. If we really wanted to, we could add it to system.text.json itself, which seems very weird in my opinion, but that would be an option we could pursue. But then, modulo the layering concerns that this thing is now very high level, you also have this problem if we ever have to support another technology, let's say protobuf or something, then the design gets extremely complicated, because now effectively what we have to do is this thing, if it lives in system.text.json, then system text.json would have to depend on protobuf, which I don't think we would ever do. If we make it an independent assembly that depends on system text.json, then yes, this assembly could depend on protobuf and system text.json. That would probably be acceptable. But now you have this, standalone assembly at a very high level, and I'm not sure that we want that.
Yeah, I just think it crosses my threshold of being ugly. I mean, honestly, we would make something that today has constructors, is immutable, and it's very simple into like a very ugly thing with weird semantics. So if that's the case, you feel like you cannot live with this design, maybe we just ship it in Azure Core.
Yeah, I just feel that it doesn't, the way with the statics and being tightly coupled to JSON, that it can't grow as the BCL needs it to grow. But if we had, and again, if we had extension statics, it would totally be static factories, and we would just glue them all together with extension patterns. But we don't, and so after you left last time, when we were talking about how many different serializers are trying to be the next big thing because of things in standardization committees right now, and whatnot, that it's gonna get coupled to something else soon, and that's gonna make it get very ugly or very fast.
It's gonna be Cibor, the next one.
Maybe not, but like I think to me, Christoph, let me ask you a different question. So let's say, regardless of the shape of the type, so let's say we actually ship it as a standalone NuGet package. What would that mean to you?
That's fine.
So you're okay with taking another dependency on a net new NuGet package then? That's not a deal breaker.
I mean that is a negative, but I think this one is it's reasonable. I understand if you worry about future serialization formats, you don't want it to be in JSON.
Yeah,
that one is, I understand.
Yeah, so like to me, so I think an acceptable design would be we have a standalone NuGet package called system of binary data, which it turn depends on system text.json, and then presumably if another serialization format comes online, let's say protobuf, I'd be shocked if the Azure SDK wouldn't have to depend on that as well anyways, in which case if we add the dependency directly to system binary data as well, and now you have, different static methods and different instance methods on the type, that seems fine. Yeah.
Another thing I would, I think, I know that it was, tried and it was deemed difficult to do this, extensions everything feature.
Yeah.
But I don't think the C# team gave up, correct? The C# team tried and it was difficult, but it's not yet a closed project.
So the problem on this on the C# team is, I think Jared dropped off, was that part of the design initially had overlap with other things that they wanted to do. And so I think they still don't know what these other things will look like. So it's not off the table, but it's also a very far cry from having a design. One thing that might be worthwhile pushing for is extension statics, because I think that one has a much more narrow scope, and I think we could reason about what it would look like. The general pushback we likely get is that it's not clear what the syntax would be, and usually they don't like asymmetry in those cases. But I think that's an example where, in my opinion, a custom attribute would be totally fine, because I really don't care what you have to do on the authoring side. I just care about the consumption experience. But again, like even if we were to do that, likely this would be whatever the next C# version is that ships in the .NET 6 timeframe, which would be far away for you, and it also would be something that your customers would have to opt into, because in NetCenter you don't get it by default.
Yeah, but I was thinking like, what we would do if we shipped it as a high-level component and then we wanted to add a new serialization format. I do think that it would be better if, we allowed adding new serialization formats. For that, we have some more time. So if extension statics were added to C#,
right,
I think we could use it for future formats that show up in 3-5 years.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing we should probably do though is that, because that's kind of the other problem with the constructors, is I would remove the JSON constructor and make that an actual static, because that one we can name. So otherwise it's ambiguous that you want to serialize something, but with what serializer do you want to serialize it, right? So we would only have the constructors that are actually directly coming from binary data as well, and then everything else you would have to go through a static method, which seems fine to me. It also removes the problem of async, right? Because all the other ones are, of course, non-async to begin with. I'm not sure how you feel about that, but I mean, to me, string and JSON are not things that have to go through a constructor. I think a factory would be fine.
For other serialization formats, yes. As I said, when we discussed it last week, once people learn about the type, like future evolution doesn't have to be as clean, in my opinion, because once you understand what this type is, and then in the future there's a new serialization format, you probably we will have to announce, or we will have to say, hey, here's a package and it supports now protobuf, let's say. Once somebody knows how to use this type and how it works approximately, it's fine for all the other formats, in my opinion, to be done purely through factory methods.
Yeah, you say that, but I mean, just look at how the type would look like then in V3, right? So do you think it's obvious when people say new binary data, and then they say, they pass in their object and then it serializes a JSON, and then somewhere down the code they're basically saying no instance dot from object async, and then they sorry, not that one, to object of t, and there's no confusion that this is going through JSON?
Well, you skipped one step that I think is critical, which is if let's say the protobuf is done through extension methods, then it means you need to grab a package that has protobuf extensions for binary data. And at that point, you kind of know that you're looking for it. If you don't want to if you want to implement the feature such that the user doesn't need to know about an extension package, well, then you need to take direct dependency, and then you can make it into a constructor parameter and just the enum, as we discussed last time, which is basically it's an enum that selects which serializer you're using. So I think there are two kind of paths. One is relies on an external package with extension methods, and at that point, I know what I'm looking for. I'm trying to do protobuf extensions on binary data. And if we are okay with taking direct dependency from this package to protobuf, then we can just add a constructor for protobuf serialization.
Yeah, I mean, even ignoring extensions or not, even if you assume binary data directly depends on it, I think it's always weird if you basically call a constructor where the encoding of data type isn't clear, right? So for example, take the string one, right? We said the string one is fine because we don't believe there's any scenario where somebody wants UTF-16. But let's say you have APIs where both UTF-16 and UTF-8 would be sensible, then we generally wouldn't give you the string constructor either, right? We would generally say you have a factory method and the naming implies whether you get UTF-8 or UTF-16, right? So we try to avoid ambiguity in shape.
But why we would not just add a second parameter to the constructor to control which serialization format or which encoding is used?
Yeah, I mean, my personal argument would be that because it's versioned over time, people don't see it, right? They only see the resulting call side, and then they have to fuck with their IntelliSense to actually see, oh yeah, there's an overload that takes a format. Oh, the format could be protobuf or JSON, and I passed in the wrong one, right? How discoverable are these things? Versus if you call for, in V1, you call binary data dot, from object JSON or something, it's pretty obvious that you're getting a JSON encoded thing, right? There's no mystery there.
I don't know. Are you arguing that a method name that says what serialization format you have versus a parameter that is an enum is more discoverable? One is more discoverable than the other?
Well, but then you would want to not have a default value for that enum.
Right.
Which means we need to define it now, and you need to write, thingy formats.json. Putting JSON in the method name was shorter.
That's kind of where I'm getting at. Like if
Decoupled.
if you basically assert in v1 we'll never need something else, and so we ship without that enum, then that problem exists, right? If we are saying in v1 we already assert that there will be multiple formats and it might just be 2, but we ship this thing from day one with, you have to specify the encoding as part of a parameter, then I think it's also fine.
So you're saying that if we added an overload to the constructor, let's talk about the string one. If we added in the future an overload that takes an enum with 2 values, UTF-8 and UTF-16, that would not be discoverable. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't say not. I would say less. I mean, for the string one, I think we convinced ourselves that nobody ever cares about UTF-16 or UTF-7 or ASCII. So UTF-8 is the only one that 99% of people will care about. With the JSON one, I'm not convinced that the percentage will be 99%. I think, like, as Jeremy indicated, I think very quickly there will be maybe 70-30, 60-40, depending on your viewpoint, right? Whether you want to use this new binary thingy or you want to use JSON, right? I think JSON will be still very popular when you talk about a REST API you want to consume from JavaScript, but if you just use it as I just want to conveniently get this object model in some sort of fashion so I can persist it, I think people will care about other things way more than about the fact that it's JSON, right? And then basically prioritizing JSON in the API might be a mistake.
So, but so the way I would let's explore, what could happen. So, let's say 3 other serialization formats become popular and we need to support them. And we have now those 2 paths, correct? One is we have static extension methods for C# in C#,
right?
Or we don't,
right?
So if we have static extension methods, we would just add the methods from and to.
Right.
Is that right? If we don't, we would add like some enum value and take direct dependency on these serialization technologies. It's a high-level component, so we are fine with that, presumably. And then you're saying, because there's an overload that basically defaults to JSON, we don't like it.
Yeah, to me, it's like if you would say, we don't have the constructor for JSON, we only have the factory methods today. I think that's also less of a problem because it's named, right? You basically indicate what you are getting. Like, to me, the problem really is you pass in an object, and then if you look at the call side, nothing of the call side implies JSON. You don't pass in an enum, you don't have a named method, and then later on it turns out there's more ways to do that, and it's not an implementation detail, it's totally part of what you want for this to happen. That to me seems like a trap. If in V1 we basically say there's, you already have an enum, the enum only has one member, but you're always forced to pass it in, then basically all the call sides will say JSON one way or the other. They either say it as part of the enum or they say it as part of the method name. But then it's very clear that, you get JSON because that's what you asked for. And so if there's multiple options now, well, then what do you have to change? Well, if it's a method name, you call it a different method. If it's an enum member, you'd select a different enum member, right? It's a pretty straightforward path.
Yeah. So I can see how it's not ideal, but I still come back to, I think evolution like this after a couple of years when people actually understand the type is, in my opinion, it would be fine if JSON is always kind of maybe a bit preferred, as long as the other things can be added in a reasonable fashion. And
as
the
a
reason for it.
facetious comment, would you be okay with XML being the default?
Well, no, because basically changes what I was saying. Like when you ship a type for the first time, in my opinion, it should be simple and do exactly what users want. Then as it evolves, it's fine to kind of slowly introduce users to new concepts, even if the concepts become kind of, the right way to do things. So to give you an example of something like this in the framework is we have many types that evolve through several async models. And, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world that, the currently recommended async model is not always, doesn't look like it was designed today to be the recommended async model.
I mean, I understand that part, but like, I guess the thought experiment is more along the lines of, imagine we would have built binary data 10 years ago, and we would have built it with, let's say at that point, probably data contextualization in mind.
Yeah.
And then the question is, okay, if you had this type now in the framework that effectively gets preferred treatment to, the data contract XML serializer, would you still use that type in the Azure SDK today? Or would you build your own just because the default is wrong?
No, so I think this is a great analogy, what you just said. So imagine that it was built, 10 years ago, and the constructor was the, XML serializable object. But by that time, users already learned that there are those from and to methods, and they were seeking JSON serialization, and they discovered that they were just added as, either static methods that they have to use, or there's a constructor overload that takes an enum and you can switch to JSON. That's when you instantiate the object. When you use it and you want to, get your object back, you get an instance method, you just pass this, parameter and you're done. I think that would be fine, exactly for the reason that I mentioned. After, some years, people already know how type works. When there's an evolution of the type, there's a blog post and says, hey, here's a new feature, here's how you use it. And people kind of understand and appreciate why things are done the way they are done.
People who've already used the previous one. But
correct.
For new people, it's still possibly even more confusing than if we just done it. It takes everyone slightly 5 minutes longer to learn how to use it the first time, but everybody's on the same keel, and you don't have to look at code and be like, wait, I've never seen before where someone called and didn't say that they were using protobuf. Like, what does that even do? Oh, that does JSON? Who does JSON anymore?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's true that for new people, suddenly if they never knew this type, but how many people, either the type will not be successful, or a lot of people, current .NET Framework customers, will know this type by the time we are adding new serialization technologies.
I mean, they both scare me as an outcome, but for different reasons.
My guess is the next serialization technology gets major support from us in 7. So I think we're talking 2 years. I don't think that's enough time for people to really even get comfortable with the type.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I'm heading at as well. Like, I mean, to Jeremy's point, I mean, we do know from usability studies that people have a problem with choices, right? And I feel like that is, we see this all over the place, right? I want to say like 6 months ago, they did a test with people that have never used Visual Studio, but they have used other IDEs like Eclipse or IntelliJ, or I forgot the other names that they came from. But basically, set them in front of Visual Studio, and they basically asked them to do things that we now consider modern, right? Create a new ASP.NET Core app, create a console app for .NET Framework, that sort of thing, and like they just failed spectacularly, right? And that is basically the direct outcome of what Jeremy said, right? Like if you have 15 years experience on the platform, every time you learn something, the delta is small, and then after 15 years, you accumulated so much knowledge that you can navigate all these weirdnesses you now see. But if you're net new to the platform, these things don't make sense to you. And then to Jeremy's point, in 3 years from now, maybe if the thing defaults to JSON, feels ridiculously arcane, right? In the same way that today we think XML data contextualization seems ridiculously arcane, right? And I think that to me is kind of the problem with these types, is that if we think of this type as a timeless platform type, then those kind of policy decisions seems bad
But
from the
I
point of
think-
view you optimize for a very short term
Yeah.
only.
But it's just, I mean, it's not only optimized for short term. Also, if let's talk about the alternative, because I think we have, we have to trade off between small kind of words that potentially will be there in the future that I kind of have to say they seem to me super small. They are not massive problems that people will be really confused about. They are small words. I grant you that. And then we have to trade it off with the alternative. So what is the alternative?
Well, the alternative to me would be we basically say, we make all the things like serialization that have heavy policy, we make them statics, and then we still ship the type today with being hardwired to JSON because, well, that's the only thing we can do. And then, in 2 years from now, when we actually have language support for extension statics, maybe we do protobuf as the same thing. But no, the nice thing for the consumer is, depending on what your dependency closure is, which an Azure SDK would include protobuf probably anyway, then the IntelliSense will look exactly the same. I mean, there's some, minor differences with extension statics and regular statics, but like people don't have to think about this, whether they say from JSON or from protobuf, the syntax looks the same, the expressiveness is the same. It feels very like it all gels very nicely. There's not this steep fall off that you suddenly have. Oh yeah, no, you go from a constructor to a named method. You have to kind of rewrite the code, right? Every time we have these, like, I guess, changes in modality in which you operate with something, that's when you tend to lose people, right? And I feel like that's okay for fringe scenarios. It's, I think, less okay for scenarios that we think are core, right? And I think, like, the question is, in 3 years from now, do we still believe that JSON is the 99% scenario? And I think the evidence suggests otherwise. And that's why I don't want to corner myself where I say, yes, I design for usability, but to me, usability also in 2 years from now, not just for today, right?
Well, so I still stand behind you trading off a small word for a massive usability problem. I can almost guarantee that if we remove the object constructor, this type would not be successful in usability.
But that's, I guess my question is, like, why do you believe that's true? Because now, let's say you do a fast forward 3 years from now, you have a choice between JSON and protobuf, and the fair comparison is not you have a person that has used the type for 3 years. The fair comparison is you have a net new customer that is exactly as new as today for binary data. If you believe that not having a constructor is a massive usability hit, then it is a massive usability hit for that person to use protobuf.
No, it's not, because if there's another format that is so common that we want to make it the default, I would just take dependency from this type at the constructor that takes object enum value that switches between JSON and the other one, and the type, and there won't be a usability issue.
You're basically saying
but it wouldn't be the default, though.
And you said, why do I think there will be usability issue if we remove this constructor? I'm absolutely sure of that because I've seen it.
I think the problem with the constructor thing, and that's the thing I don't have data on, which I think is the thing I would be willing to test, is I think if you have no constructors, then people will try static methods before. But like if you have some constructors, I think people will assume that's the only way they can construct the type. But then I think I buy the argument that your problem is not the default versus non-default. Your problem is it's the constructor versus a factory, and I think I can agree with that.
Yeah, and also the additional difficulty to what you said is that we cannot remove all constructors from this type because it will always have a default constructor, and it really confuses people because they basically instantiate it. They don't. Then, if it's a class, it doesn't have a constructor. We've seen it. It still confuses some people but some people after a while go and see the static methods. Unfortunately for structs, they just create an instance of it and then they keep searching around how to do something with this instance.
Right, but I think that if it only has a default constructor, like somebody's going to look for properties or set methods to load in the data they want. So that's the Emo's suggestion of everything being async extension instance methods. Feels, I mean, granted, I haven't done a usability study, but it feels to me like it's, you know, like a 10-second roadblock, not a, oh my God, what's going on? So that's why I liked that one, because it didn't, like, yes, as far as the fact that it's technically immutable struct and all this is sort of new things, but from the user experience, they probably don't notice it's a class versus a struct. Yeah, if you call two sets, it throws, but most people would never try that, and if they do, we had it throw so that it wasn't a mutable struct with all the mutable struct consequences. And like, to me, it feels like that it has good growth and it has good discoverability. Yeah. But I do agree that extension statics, if we had them, would be the route that we would go.
Okay, so many things that you said, they are kind of true, except, I don't know, are you proposing that we go back to having a mutable struct with a default constructor that doesn't do anything useful and then having instance methods that mutate the type? Is that your proposal?
I think it keeps everything on an even keel, lets us, it gives us good evolution, and I don't think it carries a lot of confusion with it. And if you're concerned about mutable struct, we can replace the word struct with class.
Yeah, so as I said, to me, this type becomes so ugly, and so, like, it has basically, we just added 3 different usability roadblocks, and I agree that maybe each of them is, you know, is small, but it's, you know, the end result is super ugly. I would just ship it in Azure Core at that point. So now the other things that we started to consider, like small tweaks, you know, adding enums and whatnot, I think they may be, you know, some compromises we should consider. That one, I have to tell you, I would just like give up on trying to have a type in BCL. So I thought that we kind of, and it's fine if you say that, you know, you don't want you really are set on this mutable type with set methods. It's fine to have these positions. I'm just saying it crosses my threshold of ugliness.
I think it's less ugly. So obviously there's beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I think the question, and this is, I think, also the bias that we have. I mean, like, both Jeremy and I are more thinking about, like, what does it mean for the BCL in the long run? But that is an implementer's concern, not a user concern. I think, to me, the user concern is kind of reflected by what I said, but I see the user as changing over time, and I try to create a version that is uniform across time. That basically means, yes, I'm accepting hits for particular users at particular points in time, right? But I try to create an average over time, which is very similar to implementation level concern, in my opinion. But like, it's not entirely disjoint from that. Now the question really is like, as I said, I think this tension that we have right now, constructors versus factories, I think is something we should usability test anyways, because I think, to me, this is something that if we do that, I do have more ammunition to talk to the C# team and say, I really, really want extension statics, and here's usability study that proves why that would be useful. But again, like, it's you know, if the usability gap is ginormous between constructors and static methods, then that wouldn't be enough, right? At that point, I would ask for extension constructors. But like
async constructors.
Well, yes, or async constructors, but that, you know, both of them seem untractable, because how would you ever resolve conflicts in that world, right? But I think the question becomes is like, you know, what do we do for this particular design moving forward? Like, I don't know. I'm willing to fund the usability study from our end. I think we can probably do that. I'm just not sure how fast, because realistically we probably need at least a few weeks of like forward time to actually get people, and then actually do the study, which is probably going to take a few days, and then we would have to actually take that data and decide what to do with it. But if you want to ship in 2 months, that's that's a bit rough in terms of timeline. I mean, the time isn't big.
Yeah. So.
But it's tight.
So now going back to the proposal that you say, because I mean, I have to tell you there are like several alternatives that we explored, and some of them to me are not acceptable, and some of them I'm like skeptical, but maybe it's fine, and maybe it would be worth, if you think that to test it, to kind of have more data. So the one that you are now exploring, Imo, is to remove all constructors or not?
No, the only ones I would leave are the ones that are effectively basically different flavors of byte array. So I would leave the first one, the second one.
Yeah.
And
so
the
we
third
have
one.
that. So we have already done that study, because we've done several studies with different kind of tweaks, and we kind of the shape that we have right now, we learned about it. It's like I can show you the whole evolution of the shape. So actually we had what you just said, and the end result was the following. So they see that there's binary data and it takes basically bytes. And if we ask them in usability study to send a serialized object, they think that they have to serialize manually, which defeats the purpose of the type. Basically, they go and instantiate serializer, deal with all the problems that this type is meant to be, to solve. They serialize to a byte array or to a string and pass it to this type. So that we already have it on video. If you want to watch that study, we already have done it.
Yeah, but I would remove all constructors.
The moment you remove all constructors, I'm not sure if we have this study, but we've been doing usability studies literally every week, one study. And what happens is people get confused because structs have constructors, and they instantiate, and then they get completely lost because they don't know how to initialize this type. So it's even worse. Like I grant you that if we made it into a class, what happens is slightly different, is they find that they cannot instantiate this type. And some small percentage of customers get blocked, but I would say maybe 70% goes and finds static methods. But for structs, this trick doesn't work, and it makes the struct mutable and have modes.
Apparently, using the extension methods means we have to turn it into a class. Because the async set. No, the async set should still work because it'll just write back to the thing.
No, I left a comment in the issue that methods like set as JSON async can't be implemented if binary data is a struct. It's forbidden by the language. The reason for that is if it's a struct, you have to take it by ref rather than by value, and refs can't survive across an async boundary.
Well, they can't be defined with a async await, but you could.
Yes.
You can capture it.
How do you capture it? You capture by value.
You capture it as a ref this. You do all your async work in a helper method, and then you call the synchronous set. Because that's all these things are doing, because they're ultimately async drains into a synchronous set. So I think you should still be able to capture it.
That would still imply that the ref this survives across an await, because the very first thing you're going to do is await your helper method.
Yeah, I guess that's true. All right, fair enough. So extension methods won't solve the async problem if it stays a struct.
The same limitation applies to instance methods, not just extension methods.
Right. So,
for the same reason.
Right. So it would then go to a no public or only a default constructor It'd have to change into a class. But again, perf is not the strong goal here, so I don't think that the extra 40 bytes of heap are gonna really cost anything.
Yeah, Christoph, what is the reason for this to be a struct? Is it just because you defaulted to that, or is there a strong reason why this needs to be a struct?
Well, we kind of, wanted to keep it lean unless we have a reason to make it, heavier. If we feel that, changing it into a class would solve some problems, I guess that would be acceptable.
Yeah, I have to play more with it, but I think what Levi said seems right. Maybe some unsafe way to capture the the ref parameter in some weird way, but like
there's no safe way to do it. Unfortunately,
it seems like we're kind of hacking the system at that point.
Yeah, the only way we could do it would be to drop down to unsafe code within our method, which means as soon as someone defines this on the stack in the caller, we've now corrupted the stack.
Yeah. So let's change it to a class. Even no matter what we do with the constructors and other things, I think that it would give us more flexibility in the future, no matter what we choose. Because even just adding instance methods for deserialize. Imagine, one approach we could have is there are helpers to create those, but then we would want extension methods to deserialize from other formats.
Right.
Class would give us, this possibility of adding those.
One other question I had is like, what are your equal semantics? I assume you just compare the underlying array, right? For reference. You don't have value equality for the contents of the data, right?
I don't remember. I can check that.
Because we usually don't have ON.
Well, they have the equals as EB never, so I assume they just return false. They're saying there is no semantic equality on this thing.
Yeah.
Interesting. I probably would have just do a reference equality on the underlying array, but fine. I mean, like if we make it a class, I would just go with the normal reference equality semantics that the classes give you and don't do anything custom.
Right, but if you make it a class, then it's just you don't override equals.
And basically, that's what I'm saying for this. I mean, I would have probably given by the way the same semantics we give immutable array, which is it's just a reference equality comparison with the underlying array, and so it only compares for the same sources effectively, and that seems generally fine.
Well, fair, but the thing like the building it from a span means there was a copy, and so the only way you would have the same underlying array is if you were actually the same instance, at which point let the instance equality run. It's faster than invoking a custom method.
Well, yeah, but what you just said would have been true regardless of whether it's a structure or class anyway, if it's being built from a span.
Yeah.
So it always incurs a copy.
Right.
I linked to the chat room the implementation of this method. It actually calls bytes.equals.
Oh, really? You have value equality for the underlying array? That seems... Are you sure you want that?
I'm not sure. That may be... I don't... My care level about this is very low, but...
Yeah, I thought your guys' guidelines was only the strong typed equals should do things, and if you don't have a strong typed equals, that's when you EB never the object equals to indicate this is stupid, don't call it.
Yeah, we just did whatever read-only memory of bytes does.
That's a shallow equality.
Okay, that's what this method implementation does.
So same array and same bounds.
Same array and same bound. Why would you even care about the bounds?
For comparing two read-only memories?
Yeah.
They're definitely not equal if their links aren't equal.
Oh, because you store the data as a read-only memory, not as an array. I see. I thought
so
if you,
basically,
yeah.
This type logically is a wrapper over read-only memory. Therefore, equality is the same as the read-only memory. That's
yeah.
I guess the philosophy behind the current implementation.
And I think read-only
Yeah.
memory, we basically said the same thing. It's basically shallow semantics, right? You just effectively compare the pointers into length.
Yeah. And by the way, that trips people up today. We already have evidence that trips people up.
Really?
What do they expect? What do they want?
If I have a read-only memory of char, for instance, that represents a substring of a larger string, and I call dot equals with something else, they expect that it's going to give them string value equality.
Mm. And if the strings are deduped, interned, then does it work as they expect?
Not necessarily.
If you had just the string hello and someone had a slice of hello world, the slice of hello world doesn't understand it's only hello. It wouldn't dedupe. It would keep the reference to hello world with a length.
I'm saying if both of the strings, the one that you sliced and the one that you pass in are interned, then it will work, correct?
Yes.
If they're interned to the same string.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
which you can't always rely on.
I see Jeremy is saying if they interned the slice and not the whole thing, and then I get that.
You could have a situation where binary data 1.2 string returns hello, and binary data 2.2 string also returns hello, but binary data 1 and 2 compare is not equal.
Yeah.
That's a bit weird.
I mean, that's a general problem with equality, is that people have different notions of what it is. I mean, arguably people have the same expectations for arrays, right? And we kind of taught people painstakingly that that's not what they're getting.
Right. Yeah.
In that sense, I think read-only memory and read-only span, I think, to me, makes sense that they have the same semantics as arrays, because that's basically what they are.
So by the way, one thing that we are considering, and we could address the problem, it would introduce other problems. So I'm not even sure whether we want to do it, but we've been considering storing information inside binary data that indicates how it was created. So if it, whether it was created from a string, whether it contains UTF-8 text or, JSON, it's basically like a content type kind of, you can think about it. And then one of the reasons we wanted to do it is to improve how toString works. So let's say, this thing stores UTF-8 bytes, we would just print the string. And if the thing stores just really binary data, just bytes, we would print some text, hex output. If we had that, we could also change the semantics of equals depending what's inside. So then we could basically say, if I'm storing a string, I will do, string comparison.
But isn't that just standard object-oriented like type hierarchy stuff?
Well, type hierarchy is one way to model this behavior.
Yeah,
but we're in an object-oriented framework.
Yeah, and it has some drawbacks as well.
Sure.
A.2 bytes sequence equals B.2 bytes returns true, but toString that equals toString doesn't return true. Therefore, equals doesn't return true feels.
Yeah. So
weird,
that's what I was saying. It would have some other, negatives.
Yeah, to me, it sounds more like a discriminated union at this point.
Pretty much.
But I mean, we don't have that either in the framework. But
yeah, we do. Like everything that derives from object is technically discriminated union. Technically.
I mean,
and seriously, what you're describing is like type theory.
Well, yes, I think functional people would disagree with you on that notion that type hierarchies are a good way to do discriminated unions. But
that's how F# implements them for reference types.
Right, but you do
inheritance.
But they also give you a tag, and they use that for completion matching, right, which you don't get from object-oriented hierarchies by themselves. But I think the question becomes what do we do for this type here, right? I think if to me, object orientation here seems over the board because you basically never care, right? I mean, unless you expect people to say, things like if binary data is string binary data s, and then s dot original string or something, then maybe, but presumably you would only do that.
I expect either that or if binary data dot content type equals string, then call binary data dot toString. I mean, they're equivalent-ish. I mean, clearly you all have performed usability studies and I haven't, so you would know what the trade-offs are, but in my mind, they're exactly equivalent.
I don't think he was talking about exposing it. I think he was talking about just tracking it.
Yeah, that's how I understood it. I think that to me the downside with doing what you suggest, Levi, is that you, like, if you think this to an end, let's say we have like 6 or 7 derivatives of binary data, that seems fairly heavyweight for something that you probably never ever want to access. Like at that point, I think like literally just exposing properties on the type seems cleaner, because then you're like, well, if you really need this, then you can, but we're not polluting the system namespace with like 6 types. That seems I mean, we could also have nested types under binary data, and we can play tricks like that, but I feel like types have a higher concept count cost than some properties on the type. And I think the way I understood Christoph's scenario is more like you want people to make sense of, object or toString.
Yeah.
I mean, in fairness, though, like I think, Christoph, you can probably hack that in toString today, but just doing some smart introspection of the payload. Like if you basically say the first 4 or 5 characters are all within the text range, we just print it as a string or something, right? That would probably go a long way.
Yeah, but I mean, I mentioned this as a way to control what toString does, but we also want to use it. We were considering using it as an automatic content type. So if you send it over the wire and it's JSON, then we, say it's JSON. If it's UTF-8, we say it's UTF-8. So we wanted to do it for other things as well. And, like having some heuristics that guess doesn't seem like appropriate thing for
those things. Yeah, I agree with that.
For sending data over the network.
I mean, like content type seems like a useful thing, but that's also, strictly speaking, that's not your tracking where the data coming from. You're just inferring the content type based on how the type was constructed, right?
Well, but if it's JSON serializable object constructor called, we know it's JSON.
How do you track that across the network? Like if the binary, when you get the bytes that are the binary data object, like you lose the information about what the content type is, right?
If I get bytes from where? From the network?
Yeah, so if I wrap a binary data around a string, for instance, and then I send that off to the Azure endpoint, like the only bytes that are actually going to go across a wire are the bytes that are the UTF-8 representation of the string. You lose the fact that it was created from a string, correct?
No. So many of the places where we would use it, there is actually a content type anyway. It's just today what you have to do is you have to manually specify. So we have to have constructors that take binary data and content type. And now we could have constructors, methods that only take binary data.
Yeah, I think adding content type would definitely invalidate it from the BCL.
And really?
Well, because it's either just a string, at which point we're just taking the HTTP notion of content type and shoving it down and making people specify it when they only care if it goes over the wire. / now we have, again, complicatedly different modes of the object. Or it's an enum, at which point the type's no longer extensible.
Well, I mean, I would not go that far. I think it's reasonable to say, let's say we would have a content type property. Let's say that's of type string, because I agree with you, an enum would be bad probably. But if we make it a string, you could imagine that all the constructors that take binary payloads right now, they have an optional parameter that is the content type. And then the same applies for the JSON one, except that the JSON one, if you don't specify one, we just auto set it to text/JSON, right? Or something like that, right? I think that seems still just fairly reasonable. I mean,
it feels like it moved it from how you talk about some bytes to how you talk about some bytes over HTTP.
Well, you still talk about some bytes. You basically just say like you have a tag with that data that tells you what the binary data is, which I think still to me makes sense for a type called binary data, because Christoph gave a few examples where that's useful. I mean, content type or MIME type is one, but yeah, like I don't know, like it doesn't seem to me like you're not extending the role of the type. You just make it more usable.
But anyway, this is an additive change, so we can let's punt it for now, especially that we don't have it yet. It's not designed, so.
Right, so we are over time. Do we have any conclusions? I think we concluded it should be a class.
Yeah, that one I think we seem to be all in agreement with. But like, what are the next steps? So I can try to, like, I don't know, Christoph, who does usability studies on your side. I can talk to them, and then we can decide how we want to schedule this. I think it would be reasonable for us to test the design that I sketched to just see where this is. Because even if we don't use it for binary data, I still think it would be useful usability study for us, so I'm willing to fund that.
The zero strong constructors.
Yeah, basically the design that I currently have, which is you have no constructors, you basically are forced to use factory methods / extension methods. And so basically this would be this design here with just statics, and this design here with everything as instance methods, and then see how people fare with that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that would be hard to figure out how to do in this is figure out what it would mean to add protobuf and see how confusing it is when there's, like, whatever we would come up with for protobuf or some other technology, that there's now one thing that looks slightly different than the rest, and does that just totally baffle people or not?
Well, I think Christoph's proposal for that was not factories, right? It was basically you just add an overload that takes an enum.
Exactly, because I think my assumption is that if it's some critical format for us, we wouldn't be afraid of taking dependency on it. And if it's not critical, it's fine. It's static methods, just like today asyncs are static methods anyway. So you don't find it as a constructor.
Yeah, the only downside of that line of thinking is that we very rarely find ourselves in a category where we can decide what's critical. It's basically things are growing, and so then the question is when is the right time, and then by the time you know it's critical, well, you already shipped the design that is the ugly one, right? And then you don't want to change it.
Well, it's not uglier one. It's static methods.
Well, but
it's like,
only we can do that. Like, if Azure SDK wanted to add protobuf support but not bump their dependency to .NET 8, where we had finally added it, even though we had good protobuf support in 6, then now you don't have a good pattern you can follow because you can't.
Okay, let's talk about that one, because I think that one is also a thing that I, as you can see here by the header, like I leave this open, but like I think no matter what we do, we have to ship this as a NuGet package, targeting that standard in order for this to be useful for the Azure SDK at all. Right? Okay. So then if we do that, then I think, the way I would design the thing at this point is I would say it's a net new assembly, it's a net new NuGet package, it's inbox for .NET 6, but it basically has the same characteristic that immutable collections have, which is we can always bump the thing and reference a new version and replace the inbox one, because then that means the API service isn't frozen. It's similar to JSON. You can just rev it and like things work out.
It does force anything that we think would go on this type to then publish a net standard implementation, which management's not always on board with.
Hold on, like what you mean? Like, yeah, I mean, to me, this is the thing I already talked with Dan about. Like that to me is, the way I see this is it's exactly the same Azure SDK ask as JSON.NET 2.0 was, and I have an action item on my side to basically write up the rules of the rules of engagement, if you will, and basically get the directors to just greenlight that, so we don't have to have a one-off case law where everything these things are happening. Because
but I think CBOR we shipped as net 5 only.
Right, because nobody needed it, right? I think so the thing is, yes, we have this default that we're basically saying everything is inbox by default. We don't ship things down level, unless we have a partner like Azure SDK that for business reasons need a down level version. And this one, I mean, given that it comes from the Azure SDK, like to me, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Like if we ship this for .NET 6 only, we might as well not ship it at all because it's not useful to them, right? Like it's a pie in the sky thing that they will never use. So
the test would then be we get to add CBOR to this the moment that Christoph wants it, and then we have to go back and make the CBOR package work for Net Standard 2.0. Like, is that the order we would be doing? Because if it's extension methods, then you can make the decision that CBOR now supports Net Standard 2.0 and also supports binary data.
I mean, generally speaking, we feel better about shipping things down level after we ship the inbox version, right? Because at that point, the inbox version is obviously locked. But for things where we think the inbox version is revving, that's where we don't feel warm and fuzzy about this thing anymore, because now it has all this complexity that we have, right? Now, the thing with binary data is that it doesn't have to go to system runtime, right? We don't have to do any crazy type forwarding, because we already said this thing is a high-level type. It's a leaf node in our dependency graph, right? It depends on system text.json. It depends on memory of T and all the other, system.memory and all the other packages we already have. So this one is a very high-level package, and this one we can just say the identity refs independently, which means even if you put it in box, we can replace its contents, which means the API service isn't frozen. We can add new things over time. If, in .NET 7, let's say, we have to add protobuf, or we just add the protobuf constructors, and we can ship a .NET Standard 2.0 version of that package that also has those constructors, because if you were to publish this to a .NET 6 application that only ships the old version inbox, you replace the inbox version one, right? It's the same thing as system text.json. It's the same semantics as immutable or metadata reader, because it's a leaf load component. If we ever think binary data has to be type forwarded to system runtime or some other lower level assembly, then that is much, much more difficult, and that's where we really don't want to do this, right? And that's why, span basically is frozen, because we can't add members to span anymore for that reason. But that wouldn't be the case here. So that's why I feel like from an Ubing standpoint, this is a low risk thing. We know how to do it. It felt squarely within the pattern that we have validated over years now. It just, to me, the only controversial bit here is that, yes, we ship a net new concept for an old platform, which our directors generally don't like. But again, we have done this before because we have a partner.
Sure. Just, again, for the notion of extensibility, it means if we feel that protobuf or CBOR or whatever really is net 5 or net 6 or whatever only, that we then can't add them to here. We have to, the two decisions become coupled together because it's strongly coupled instead of extension methods.
Yeah, so that's why I would say, if this goes back to the, why haven't we done CBOR out of man? And the reason was, well, because nobody asked for it, and it's easier for us to do it inbox. But at that point, it would be easier for us to have a net standard 2 version of CBOR, because then we can just take dependency on it. So I think this is why, these discussions become coupled, but I feel like it's not impossible, right? And we have solved this problem before.
Sure. Again, the thing that I like about the extension approach, assuming that it had equivalent usability, is that it does decouple a lot of things from each other. It lets pieces move independently.
Yes.
It's much more of the pay for play that people think they want.
Yeah, I agree with that. To me, the problem there isn't so much the shipping, though, because I think shipping-wise, we know how to solve it in both worlds, and they are both, to me, complexity-wise, largely equivalent. But to me, the concerning thing is, if we ship CBOR and let's say protobuf, and now binary data becomes this, the tentative float of binary data becomes pretty large. And now the question is, are all the consumers okay with that? Is the Azure SDK okay with the fact that, you get a dependency on CBOR, which they never use, right? And the answer for that might be no, right? And I think that's where extensions are a bit more nice, because, as you said, it's pay for play. Don't depend on it. You never deploy it. It's fine. I mean, yes, the linker in principle can remove those things, but it's always
Not
weird
if it's an enum.
if it's enum, it's hard. And also, it always bugs me if we, dump a whole bunch of garbage into your output folder and then say, oh yeah, the linker will take care of it, because it always seems bad to inject shit that we then rely on to be removable. So for those things, I think it makes sense to remove that. But again, CBOR doesn't strike me as super likely. I mean, correct me, but
sure,
seems more like it's just a cylinder that we happen to have.
It's a thing that I can use as a concrete example of we currently shipped it as netcore family only, and
sure,
that we would then have to go backwards and then find out if we had messed up and the contract can't go to net standard, and now we need a split contract, which already complicates the package, right? There's a bunch of tightly coupled means we have to revisit decisions from years prior.
I agree with that. I mean, back to the enum though, do we know that the enum case wouldn't work? There's no magic attribute we can put on the enum or something?
As far as I know, nothing exists yet for the linker, and as soon as anything ever took it in as a variable, nothing can trim it out. Right?
Well, I guess the way I would see this is if you ever reference that enum member, then you get the whole closure. If you don't, then you don't, and it doesn't do any tracking.
Right, but as far as I know, there's nothing that we have that says the code, it wouldn't see the code paths that that pulled in CBOR only exist in these switches, or in these switch statements. Therefore, it has a dependency on this field. They could theoretically write it. I just don't think they've done that yet, and it's probably I have no idea how many years out that is on their priorities.
No, I don't think it's possible because you can read an int from a file, cast it to the enum, and pass it to the.
Yeah, and the moment anyone does that, everything becomes.
Well, but that's not the problem, right? Because we have that in other cases, right? Your constructor that takes object and type has the same problem, right? The linker has no way to know that you now have to retain these types, right? But like the question is more like, is idiomatic code linkable, right? Like if you don't read an enum from a file and cast it to an int, is the linker smart enough to realize that? And the answer is today no, but like, could we envision linker annotations on the enum that would make that possible, right? Because I would agree with Jeremy, like if basically the enum design would mean you can never link shit out, that might be okay if there's only 1 and 2 technologies in there. That becomes more of a liability when there's like 4 or 5, right? And then the question is, shit, now we have to retain, all the serializers because the Azure SDK, which we assume everybody will ever use because we want everybody to use Azure, now depends on everything, every technology that we care about. That might be wrong, right? And
I mean, to be fair, we could use like a JSON file to control that, right? Like we do with some other stuff. So it's not like there's no way to resolve it. It's just unclean to resolve it.
Yes. On the other hand, though, like we don't think of the linker as this super advanced, C++ developer target audience, right? I mean, that's where we are today. But like the point of this exercise to make it simpler is to say the average Joe can turn the linker on, and it doesn't remove shit that he actually uses. So the resulting app, definitely works, but also is not ginormously large, right? So we want this to be path of success based, right? We are okay with framework authors like us having to sprinkle a fuck ton of API with magic attributes to support the linker infrastructure, but we also like want to have designs that we can actually reason about, right? And so
but what we did for ASP.NET, for instance, is we have a very clear error message that's displayed if you don't set the appropriate linker options that says, hey, you need to go back to your project JSON and set this exact line in it. Granted, it is unclean and it is an extra step, but we at least have precedent for it if it really came down to it.
I would say nothing irritates people more than being told what to go change in their code, but I guess that's not true. Not being told what to change in their code when they still need to change something in their code probably irritates more.
I guess this is more akin to like you have a missing dependency. This is how you pull the dependency back in.
Right.
That's really what the message is trying to convey.
Yeah. But it would be the case that the Azure SDK, if they ever exposed that enum as an input from any of their public methods, then at their closure level, it's still not provable. And I do think you can only link applications, but still did it ever go into and out of object? It lost the flow. Everything's in the graph now, right? Like,
I'm skeptical that automatic trimming here would work, but again, the way I would do it is initially those are just new algorithms or new formats or extension methods or helpers, and then if they become, Imo said initially they we may not know that it's super successful format. So initially they are just an external package, and then we can pull them in if they become super critical.
Right.
And it's not going to happen with 50 formats over the next 10, 15 years. It's going to happen with 1 or 2, and I think we can afford it. Just like we today take dependency on UTF-8, 16, and probably 32, and it's not a big deal. And
it's the linking stuff would work if everything's distinct methods, because it would see you never called a method that used JSON serializer. I can remove it. Like after I removed all the public methods you never called, nothing had a dependency on this anymore. I can drop the whole library. But if it's an enum, something in the method body still can talk about the type, so it stays relevant. That's where don't take enums. Don't take a 4-way enum if you can make 4 side-by-side methods.
That's what I was saying. If they are just helper methods because the format is not yet at the top of the stack. The moment it's at the top of the stack, what I was saying, I don't mind the dependency that it's not trimmed.
I think Chris's argument is like if something is successful, your chance of somebody somewhere using it is close to 100% anyways, in which case you stop caring, right? So take, for example, UTF-8 and UTF-32, UTF-16, UTF-8. like there's no apps you can realistically write today that would link one of these sites out, because the whole stack relies on both, right? And so at that point, you basically just say, fuck it, we just pay for this because it's a platform feature. It's always there, and yes, you can never link it out. And I think that's, I mean, I'm not sure that I would buy this for serializers, but like I can buy this argument in principle where, yeah, it's also not a huge list. Right? I mean, even if we say we're very generous, realistically, this enum will probably have 3 members, right? And I think that seems
fair enough,
absorbable. I'm more, the problem I have is more like the interim, because I feel like we experiment a lot, and so things will show up, and then the question is like, what does that look like, right? So I feel like on our team, like the complexity we have to deal with, we still have to design extension methods, we still have to design the packages, we still have to ship them, and we still have to tell users how to compose that, because we will experiment with, let's say Seaborg, Protobuf, BSON, or whatever else is out there. God knows whether we ever have to support YAML thanks to our friends in DevOps, but I can totally see a world where we have to ship a decent amount of packages, because even though the successful ones are only 3, we still have to model the long tail, which might be more than 3, right? And then that still is a price we have to pay for.
Well, and we would need the pattern of what we're supposed to do for YAML serializer to binary data, because it can't be a static on here, because we don't, until we have extension statics, and once we have extension statics, then sure, everything.
But so I can, the pattern that I would see is, let's say there's a new package with Seaborg serializer, and in this package there would be an extension method to object. Correct. So it's an extension method that immediately appears on binary data as a extension method, and then you have Seaborg serializer that create binary data or serialize to binary data, and you pass an object that gives you binary data. So yes, initially they are in separate package, but you grab the package because you knew that you needed Seaborg, because it's not yet at the top of the usage list. But you grabbed it, and you have those 2 methods. You can very quickly create binary data, and you can get object out. Then let's say Seaborg becomes a D format for network exchange, and then we just say, we now take dependency from this package to the Seaborg package, and we just pull it in basically.
Right, but you can't. If you make an extension method called toObject, it loses to the instance method. So that extension method never gets called. It needs a new name. Yeah, and that's part of the why I think that putting the word JSON in the current one that's toObject, and not ever doing the enum thing, and just making toObject from JSON, toObject from Seaborg, toObject from Protobuf, that is a very good, easy, understandable pattern, and such.
Yeah, so the only difference between what I was saying and what you're saying is to rename the 2 methods to specify what's the expected format.
Yeah, I would really like the current things that are from object and toObject to say the word JSON in them somewhere. And then we understand what the pattern is. It's new types get their name in that spot. That works for an extension method. It works for we move the static locally. It's a pattern we can follow. And yes, we'll have this weird thing in the middle that Seaborg serializer has Seaborg serializer dot to binary data, that then later people would expect that they would call binary data dot from Seaborg object, or from object as Seaborg or whatever, right?
No, well, but don't say whatever, because it's important. Because I think that for toObject we have a solution. We could make it. From I don't really know what it would be.
Right, because the problem is you want the from to have both the from and the to. It's from an object, you want the from and an as, right? Because it's from an object you're producing bytes, but what bytes are you producing? So it's from object as JSON, and then from object as Seaborg, and.
I mean, there is also the hypothetical scenario of supporting Newtonsoft as well. I'm not saying we should support it, but it means that there might be other JSON serializers that people would want to use with this type.
Sure, and they can call that from object as Newtonsoft JSON. So,
so we should think about what the names are, because I still don't fully understand, because some of the things are so long. What would we call the methods? Jeremy.
So
what would the from be called? Let's say for now, today, what would it be called?
From object as JSON.
Yeah.
Which JSON?
Well, I think if we have extensions, I think I'm okay with saying use the right namespace, because it seems weird to have both, let's say, JSON and JSON.NET extension methods in the same file active at the same time.
And if they're both extensions, you'll get a compiler error, and you'll have to pick one by static invocation, which then solves your problem. But if it's the constructors and factory methods with new technologies being async methods, the from doesn't matter, because the only time you can get the from is to actually go edit this class. In the twos, yes, you could have the Newtonsoft JSON scenario. You would have to put some other word in there to indicate you wanted the Newtonsoft JSON equivalent, or Newtonsoft JSON to do the processing instead of the built-in one. And I don't think that's terrible, because we would just we would have named it whatever the thing is, and in the moment that somebody doesn't like our implementation and makes one on the side, they have to disambiguate it. But
yeah, I mean, that makes it a little bit shittier if those things go inbox now, because the first person then, let's say JSON would have been an extension today, and then we move it inbox now. Well, yes, now you always have to use the static method invocation, which kind of defeats the purpose, right? But I feel like that's probably not very likely.
Well, or you just make well, if it went inbox, in order to hit the previous one you were calling, you'd have to call with the static invocation, or you make a local extension method with a different name that forwards to the previous extension method.
By the way, I suspect the number of people who will want to use JSON.NET is small enough that I would not butcher the names for the built-in functionality. Like, if somebody wants to use JSON.NET, as long as we have a parent. I agree that we should kind of work out what the parent is to add a new format out of band. I agree with that one. But then we would just tell them, make your names a bit more ugly, because, well, you are an extension.
Right. So I think we would get, to object would be to object from JSON. And then for Newtonsoft, if somebody was hooking this up in Newtonsoft JSON, they would make it to object from Newtonsoft JSON. And effectively, they name their format Newtonsoft JSON.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to do it.
I'm fine with that. But I have to tell you, I'm not even convinced that I would we need to rename the two method. I'm just saying there's a default one that is built in. If you add JSON.NET, you add a method to object from JSON.NET.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that at the same time. Like, I'm 100% certain that we will have one more format in the future, and it seems like that seems a bit far for me, for my taste.
Yeah, I would really like whatever we pick, that we have a suggestion for. Here's what you do to add a weak dependency. Here's the pattern we recommend you follow for if you're hooking up a protobuf serializer into this. This is the pattern. This is what you should call the to method. This is what you should call your local from method. And if we add the from directly on the type later, then they're aliases. And in fact, our new from would probably just call their existing static. But these are
the only thing I would say is it seems to me without extension statics, it's all pie in the sky right now anyway, right? So
so I'm typing it right now. I think it looking all the same is a bit of a geez, I also need some drink. Without it's not gonna look awesome, but it's doable.
Well, yeah, to me the bigger problem is as soon as you can't do extension statics, discoverability of those things is basically terrible.
Indeed, but it would be, man, I'm using the JSON, or I'm using the protobuf serializer, and it produces oh, hey, look, they also produced one that produces binary data, so I don't have to just wrap the call myself. I mean, granted, it's just wrapping the call itself, but but figuring out what the pattern we think that they should do. The static extensions makes it so much easier, because you would just static extension the correct from, and then we would never forward it. But
that's my point. So I mean, I guess I'm saying the pattern that we talked about only makes sense when you can do extension settings, because if there's no pattern, then it's like, well, protobuf better instantiates already binary data for me, because otherwise I have to write the glue code myself. Which
Right,
again,
so-
I mean, it's not hard. It's just that that's the only purpose of this type, right? So it's a bit like not doing your job at that point.
Right. It would be, that protobuf serializer, we expect it to have a 2 binary data method, whether it's instance or static, depending on how the serializer works. And then that later, if it becomes a tightly coupled or we get static extensions, then we add the from object as protobuf.
So as a thought experiment, what would be, so let's say JSON, like system.text.json would be an extension today, right? What would that look like? Would we basically say JSON serializer dot serialize as binary data as the thing we would do then? Like what would be our entry point there?
All right, I shared my screen if you guys are interested. I would actually start with something like this.
That's why I'm kind of like saying, like, we could do this for JSON serializer as well, as except we already have serialized and deserialized, so you would have to suffix those method names, right?
But
Anything that already had a serializer before we ship this package would need to figure out what their bridge names were. But yeah.
I would actually use those names, and I would have different names than the default ones in binary data. I would literally do that. No, I misspelled that data.
Sorry, I'm not following. What do you mean by the default ones in binary data?
So the default ones in binary data are called from and to. But if you add an extension, let's say CBOR serializer, I would just call them serialize, deserialize.
So you don't get binary data dot to object from CBOR?
No, you get deserialize.
So then why would we put JSON on the object and not just follow the same pattern from JSON?
Because we want to optimize for things in box being super usable. Just like when you buy a car, the radio is built in, works, you have buttons and everything works awesome. If you're not happy with the stereo and you want to install a big subwoofer in the trunk and, various things, you are willing to put up with a bit of learning, you're grabbing a component, external component package, and you're willing to put up with some level of additional difficulty.
Sure, but aftermarket radios are still called radios. They're not called speaker input provider manager factory, right? Like they're so in that sense, I understand the thing you're saying, but at the same time, it seems weird to me to have different naming conventions.
Well, the reason for it is that, this type that I have on the screen looks like a normal type in isolation, and it works as an extension or a helper. So now let's try to rename it. I can tell you that we cannot rename the methods on binary data because we also usability studied that. In fact, we usability studied calling those two methods serialize and deserialize, and it was a complete failure. So
which two methods?
So basically on binary data, we had one study where, there were methods called from and to, but the serializer methods were called serialize and deserialize.
I see. So basically the serializer, so the constructor you have right now and the from object and to object ones were basically serialized methods.
Yeah, correct. But the others were called from and to, like string and so on and so on. It was just complete failure. So we discovered that if we named all methods are called now from and to, suddenly the problem went away because people basically just either look at static methods or instance methods, find that there are only instance methods called to, and then type to, and then see all the options and select one of the options. The moment we had methods called serialize, deserialize, they would literally just not pay attention to them. They thought it's kind of some kind of plumbing.
That kind of resonates with what my expectation would have been. So, but it seems like you're now making the case for this pattern that you just have on the screen shouldn't be then.
Yeah, because I'm saying the moment I'm grabbing an external component, I use binary data, and now I need to use serialize to CBOR and deserialize.
But see,
grabbing an external component, I look at the component, it has the serializer and has those extension methods, or I looked up at some code sample. I think people will be fine. On the other hand, renaming these methods, so now the question is, can we rename those methods? And is that what you were proposing, that we call them to and from?
Yeah, so I mean, like, so rename the second occurrence JSON serializer, because we already shipped that one, right? So like, I think the JSON serializer is a good example. We already have serialize and deserialize on JSON serializer. And so Protobuf already shipped as well. So I think the vast majority of serializers that we would plug in have already shipped. So they have some sort of method today that allows customers to serialize and deserialize.
Yeah.
And I think what my recommendation for those people would be, if we don't have extension statics, I would say basically have a method name that has the basically just suffixes those with binary data. So I would say if JSON wouldn't be built in, you would say JSON serializer dot serialize binary data or deserialize binary data, and then basically you just have new methods that now either return or take a binary data instance, right?
Deserialize you can overload. Serialize you can't, because you want to just change the return value.
Well, that's what I mean. Like I wouldn't overload. I would just consistently use the suffix binary data for the method name.
But
fair enough.
I sorry, don't understand.
So like
on the screen, I have two options, number 1 and number 2.
Right.
Which one do you want me to modify?
Yeah, do a third one.
The third one?
Yeah, just copy and paste this thing.
Okay.
And then instead of from and to, call it serialize binary data and deserialize binary data.
Yeah, so I don't think that having an extension method called deserialize binary data or deserialize is good, because I feel that you would get packages that, especially while they're evolving, like if they ever evolve their format, they're going to talk about both CBOR serializer and potato serializer, and while they're converting from one to the other, like, oh, if it's storage format 2, we're going to load it as what it was, and then we're going to convert it to storage format 3 and write it back in the new one. If they don't include their own name in the extension method, the moment you have 2 usings, you've lost all the extension methods.
Hold on. So the other thing I did mention is I would not make it an extension method. I would just say both are just static methods, because we can't get extension statics. It seems weird to me that one direction is off of binary data and one is not. I would just be consistent and say, well, you can do binary data, but like you basically don't get to, you don't get extensions. Basically, I would not do half of the thing. I would do symmetric behavior and say, yep, there are 2 different methods, and you call the same method on the same type, and either it's serialize or it's deserialize.
I expect a lot of people would want the deserialize. They would either make the extension method themselves, or then they would ask why we didn't add it, because it's, well, if it was from JSON, then this is an instance method. Why, if it's from CBOR, do I need to change to a static call?
Well, I don't disagree with you. It's just, I mean, I recently used the NuGet APIs, and they have an extension method for object that gives you back effectively the JSON serialized version of binary data, and I find it super annoying, because now in my IntelliSense, fucking everything has this thing on object. But like
we do have a guideline that explicitly says do not define an extension method on object.
I know. Like, it just seems weird to me. Like I never understood this desire to have it in one way but not the other. Like I like symmetry because it basically makes my APIs consistent. Right. But maybe I'm the outlier. I would just say if you have extension statics, like if we had extension statics, I would totally do this differently. I would at that point do the extension for both sides, and then I would agree with you that we should have a naming convention that makes it clear what serializer you're injecting into that namespace.
Yeah, because I think the method name needs to contain the format name, or the patterns just don't hold.
But I guess my point is that the question is also like, regardless
if they're extensions.
Yeah, so like, given that we don't get extensions for one side, I would probably not do the other. That would be my take on it. And I would say, if we don't have them, then the question is how do we want CBOR and Protobuf to support binary data so customers don't have to write the glue code? And I would say whatever methods you currently have, suffix it with binary data, and like that's the same place people invoke them. And that might be instance methods on their serializer that you knew up, or it might be static methods. totally depends on the serializer.
So, Emo, you're saying suffix with binary data. I have to say, Jeremy is pushing for suffixing with the format name.
Well, that's if they're going to be extension methods.
Yes.
Emo's saying nothing's an extension method.
Yes.
Everything uses the same static method call, and so you call cbor serializer.serialize binary data or cbor serializer.deserialize binary data. Nothing was an extension method.
I guess I'm going a step further. Like what I'm pushing for is whatever entry points the serializer currently has, whatever your method names for serialize and deserialize are, just duplicate them and suffix them with binary data, and that's your entry point. Because I think for the most part, people don't build a net new type just to support binary data, right? They will have already entry points for their serializer, and they will just add new methods there. And that might be static methods, which is the case for our serializer. There might be instance methods, which is, for example, the case for JSON.NET, because you can new up the serializer and then you call them. And so that's what I would expect them to do.
Correct. So basically, you're saying that's why I was saying I like number one, because in isolation, it just looks like a normal methods on serializable.
Right, except that what I'm asserting is that they already exist, but they don't deal with binary data because they already had to ship like 4 years ago, right? So and that's why I'm saying I would just suffix it with binary data to actually make that possible.
It makes the name long, but is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would not have the two, but yes.
And deserialize, what would you say?
It's the same thing, and I would not make it an extension method. I would just say it's you call it cbor serializer.deserialize binary data, and you pass in the data.
Yeah.
And
so then our recommendation would then be types that aren't tightly coupled on binary data should not provide extension methods. I'm just like somewhere we would be saying this is the pattern we think you should follow.
Yes, I would say that. But let's talk about this dependency management for a second. So let's say we ship cbor serializer with pattern number 1, right?
Yep.
Now this thing takes off, and now you want to say, okay, we want to support this on binary data directly. How do you do this now? Because now you have a cyclic dependency, right? So now we would have to take the whole type cbor serializer and have to move that to binary data.
Yep. Can't do it. Everything ends up in the same assembly.
Do you know what I'm talking about, Christoph?
Yes.
And so that's kind of like, if you go with pattern number 1, then basically you're permanently saying we will not support this thing on binary data unless you're willing to make a break and change for the serializer.
Unless we get through extensions everything.
Well, but that doesn't change your dependency problem, right?
No, because if it's an extension, we don't need to actually add anything to binary data.
Right, because you would promote the static from method as a binary data member, and you would do an instance extension for the deserialize, which you could define that extension layer wherever.
Yes, that is true.
Right, but without static extensions, pattern number one means it can, or honestly any of these patterns, means it can never tightly couple back with binary data. It would have to be a sidecar type whose whole purpose is it could be moved to a higher level later. It would have to be something other than the serializer type itself.
Right. Which is why I would say, I think pattern number 1 is probably the most pragmatic one, because basically what we're saying is whatever serializer entry points you have, you just have corresponding versions that take binary data or produce binary data. And I think that's probably what serializer authors will most likely end up doing.
Right, but that does mean that if, let's say protobuf does this, and then later protobuf becomes, excuse me, the de facto thing, that JSON has this instance member on binary data that no one ever wants, and protobuf, which is what everyone wants, you have to call from a static call on protobuf deserializer.
Right.
And that just feels weird.
So by the way, I also suspect serializer vendors will not want to take dependency on binary data.
I was about to say the exact same thing,
I
because
have a suspicion.
because given how high level this type is and it depends transitively on JSON, it seems problematic.
Yes, that's true. Protobuf people may ask, why does protobuf depend on JSON?
But I mean, if we look at, let's like just get at our JSON APIs, right? Because we already have a serialize method and produces a string, right? So if we just make the conversions from and to binary data better, we already talked about having an implicit conversion from span and read-only memory. I also think it's fine to have an implicit conversion from string to read-only to binary data at that point. And then, does it actually matter like what these things produce? Because like, what are the chances that you have a serializer that doesn't produce a byte array, a read-only memory, or a string? Like, I mean, almost nil at this point.
But now you're back to, hey, this Azure SDK method takes a binary data. I have some JSON tags. Or sorry, I have you're back to people don't understand the implicit conversions.
Well, I would agree with that, but I think that one I buy what Christoph said. Once people understand how binary data works, meaning they know that you can convert from string, memory, and span, and byte arrays, then, well, as long as the serializer does any of those four, which, again, I think the chance is very high that it does, the problem is solved. You don't have to have the serializers themselves support binary data directly. At that point, the only thing you would consider doing is if we had an extension pattern to directly inject those methods into binary data to improve usability. But there really isn't any gains for making it easier for people to construct the binary data from your serializer. That's already pretty straightforward. It might not be discoverable, but it is, like, in terms of lines of code, exactly as little as you can make it, right? Binary data.d equals, well, whatever your serializer methods are called, and they are most likely convertible.
That's fair.
Hey, only if you had this type, a serializer.
Who's fighting with Siri?
I don't know. Siri wanted to answer the question.
But yeah,
So you need this type, and then all the problems go away. And this type would be inside BCL very deeply.
Yep.
Oh boy. So public service announcement. My girlfriend just went on a vacation, and some guy had a minor accident, and he got bruises on the abdomen, and they just thought that, bruising in the abdomen just means he hurt himself a little bit. If you ever have somebody with bruises on the lower part of the back or the abdomen, always take them to the hospital, because you don't know whether there's any internal bleeding going on. And so apparently in his case, he injured his, liver or kidney or whatever. And so they're now taking him to the hospital. So this is one of those things that I learned in the American healthcare system. People are so scared to go to the ER, but like there depending on the indicators you have, just do a visit.
I actually heard that you don't need to even see any bruises. Like, if you get into an accident more than literally just a small bumper, to bumper.
I agree with that. That's also
you should
true.
go to a hospital and get checked.
Well, in his case, his accident was with a buggy apparently driving through the dunes, and the buggy fell on top of him. So you could argue that, yes, even without the bruising, it was very clear that maybe a hospital visit would have been in order. But like that's the thing, right? In Germany, we're not shy of doing that. The only thing where you might not want to go is because you have to wait in line for 40 minutes. But in the US, it's like, well, am I willing to shell out $1.5K for them to tell me that I'm fine?
Going back to this, I just realized if we had this serializer,
yep,
like literally everything would work the same, because we could then have public, from object and public to object.
I assume these are virtual methods you defined on a serializer, and then serializer just overrides them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
and that would be static.
Yeah. And this is what I was asking you earlier. Like, should we take your serializer abstraction and make that a BCL thing? Because it seems like we will have that problem.
So we already shipped object serializer, but if you added a serializer or whatever name we would give it, we could inherit ours from yours.
So why can't we inherit yours? Because yours ships in the Azure namespace. Is that why?
Yeah, in Azure Core, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like, it seems to me, I mean, Jeremy can correct me, but like, I like to believe that abstracting a serializer shouldn't be that hard.
I agree. Like,
and it seems very much
a serializer
useful.
seems like a thing that would be very easily base classed or interfaced or whatever. Like, really, it's because it doesn't have to be the serializer, right? It's because I think like JSON serializer is static, but it has the settings and stuff, so it would be a configured serializer instance. I mean, we wouldn't bury all that stuff in the name, but yes, you have an object that is set up to serialize something, and then you throw the thing at it. Now we need to define, does it support generic at the call site, or is the generic what you should have done at the instantiation, and it already knows what type it's doing? You do end up with complicated, like, where does payload discrimination come in? But from a simple syntax perspective, it's, I have some bytes or some text, go. Or I have an object, you already know what you're supposed to produce, give me the bytes or the text.
But take our JSON one, right? I think it's very reasonable to take our JSON static class, make that a regular class, and have a public read-only instance field effectively, or property for that matter. And then, you know, the statics just become shorthand, similar to what we do on regex, where you can either instantiate a regex or you can just call static methods on it. And then, you know, it's very simple. You just say, you know, I don't know, binary data, passing an object, and then instead of passing in an enum, you would just pass in JSON serializer.instance, right? Or CBOS serializer.instance, right? And then this way,
right. Well, I mean, yeah, you'd need, you know, JSON serializer factory of t.instance to get your t in there somewhere so that it knows what it's doing. But
because in Christop's
this is what
world,
XML serializer effectively looked like, because you said new XML serializer type of whatever, and now that instance only can do this one type. And
I see. So in Christop's world, I assume the serializer is of t, and it's bound to a particular t.
No, it's not of t.
Your instance already knows what it is.
Because we basically concluded that serializers need to be loosely, basically dynamic.
Yeah, that one you want to talk to Jan about this, because when he sees this, he will flip the table. Like, that is basically the definition of linker unfriendliness.
Well,
because there's no way for anybody to track anything.
Basically the problem is that if your serializer or a method serializes of t, you need to know the t at compile time, correct?
Yes.
And there are so many scenarios where users hand you an object and say, please serialize it and send it over the wire.
Well,
so it's like,
basically what you're saying is it's viral, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. So, and you know, it's users code. We cannot tell them to not dynamically create any, you know, not have any.
Yeah, I think the conclusion we had with the earlier discussion, I think it was the extension methods we added for HTTP client, which also had object and type. We ended up doing both, because the conclusion was, yeah, there are some cases where you don't have the type, and then it's fine, you just pay for that. But like, in many cases, you do have the type, and then you just still benefit from the linker ability, or just also runtime perf.
I mean, isn't it the case that a typed serialize and deserialize method would still accommodate the object scenario? You just pass object in the angle bracket.
No.
Well, I mean, yes, but that's you're not typing in then, right? Because if you do it with angle brackets and you say object, then you're still basically telling the runtime, like, you know, go figure out somehow what type that actually is.
I guess the reason is that I'm concerned that a dynamic serialize class or interface, whatever that is, could invite a scenario where, you know, people deserialize with the type being informed by the payload, which is known to have security implications.
Yes, that is also true. That is why we
I
Basically,
guess having a typed interface in this case might guide people towards a bit of success.
I mean, the thing with like serialize with the type payload was more like in ASP.NET. The problem that they have is that because of DI and other things, in many cases there is no static call side that wires the user code to the framework code, and so what they end up doing is they have to do make generic types at runtime in order to satisfy the call sides, and that has more overhead than just passing an object with type of type. And since they basically are the ones generating the call side, it doesn't really matter. Like they basically pass in the type that was statically known from whatever pattern they looked at, right? But the problem, I guess, for us is like, given that it would be a framework type, it seems weird that our serialized abstraction would only deal with objects and types.
Sure. I mean, we need to figure out, like, conceptually, we can add a notion of serialize and deserialize, and then yes, we would spend hundreds of man hours in decisions of, do we do it with object comma type? Do we do it of T? Do we do both? Do we, like, if it's a base class, it's reasonable because you define each one as calling the other, right? And you're just like, whatever, fine, I have a thing, I do a thing for you, you implement one of these or both of these, and we move on with life. And
yeah, one other question I had is like, for like in your world, Christoph, where do you put the JSON options? Are they going to the constructor, to the object serializer, or like where are they stored?
Yeah, you basically, the idea is, so I now copied and pasted the object serializer that we shipped. This is its shape, and basically the assumption is that if you want to specify options, you pass them to the constructor, because usually options are specific to the type of the serializer.
Gotcha.
Yeah, their state on that instance, whether it's constructor state or a settable property collection or whatever, it's again, and that's what XML serializer did. It had a bunch of stuff that were options, and once you build it, now you just call deserialize and give it the object, and it gives you the whatever text, I guess. And sorry, deserialize gives you the object, serialize gives you the text. And
yeah, I mean, it seems to me that would be a reasonable way of doing it. It would just mean that we probably would have factory methods rather than a global static JSON serializer instance, because you would then say, similar to what we have right now, where you have, was it create web options or something, we would have create web serializer of T or something, right?
Or you could have something like this on your CBOR. Basically, have public static CBOR serializer, default or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that only works when the defaults actually work for you, right? Like in JSON, there's so many cases where you have to specify the options.
Sure, yeah. But then you just use the constructor. So, of course, it would have, hey, defaults don't work for you.
Right.
So, options.
That's why I was saying, like, wherever our create web options are right now, I could imagine a similar pattern there.
Well, yeah, I mean, or you just have to say whether it's JSON serializer that we change it from static to being instance with the static methods on it, or we make some side type next to it.
Right.
You would just take one of those as a constructor argument. And now, again, you called new JSON serializer of T, which would be a side type. And then you gave it the serializer options. Like this is now an object that produces this particular kind of T.
Right.
And it extends a serializer and I serializer of T, right? Like.
But I would do this, honestly. I guess still seeing my screen.
Why would you say JSON serializable there?
Because I think we should ship today default that is JSON serializable. But then I would add format or binary data or data.
Well, but if you have the object and the serializer, what's the data format tell you? Like the instance, the object serializer told you what the format is.
Wait, bear with me.
Okay.
Bearing. Can't call it data format, but that's a different problem.
So this is the full pattern that I think is the best compromise. It's basically there are serializers that are out of band.
Right.
And the way you solve it by having an abstraction, and then you pass this abstraction as a second parameter. There are also some formats that are built in, meaning we take dependency on this serializer because we feel it's very important. And that one is much easier. You don't have to worry about abstractions. You don't need to kind of figure out what's a subtype of object serializer. You just pass an enum value, and let's say XML is important, so we add XML.
But presumably that means your first two constructors don't take an object serializer then, right? Otherwise it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, now it makes sense to me, because what's the difference between them?
It was copy and paste. Okay, so there's basically.
I think you meant the other one, but.
You know, in for the purpose of 2020, it's JSON, and we want to teach people how this thing works. For now, we selected the current most popular format. It's the first constructor.
Right, so I guess the parameter name for the first one is JSON serializable, and for the last one it would be object, right?
And the other one this one would be just.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that one now I understand what your proposal is.
Basically, there's a whole progression from built-in and default, built-in not default, and then externally extensive.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that if we have easy singletons or easy factories for JSON and XML, I don't know that the enum one buys a lot, but that would be a discussion for a later date. Because if you just said binary data,
well, it's discoverability,
comma,
right?
JSON serializer dot default.
I think the problem is, like, how do you discover that type, right?
Fair enough.
I mean, I don't know, like, you could imagine that maybe object serializer sits so high level. Maybe that one can have them, but like then you have the same problem as before. You just tie everything together again. Which arguably is the same problem that the enum has, except with harder to be traced.
Mm-hmm. Yes, effectively, I think we would end up with the thing that the linker people would say to this is, great, write a linker specific analyzer that says if you ever call the data format one, rewrite it to call the other one, passing in the instance of which one you wanted to use.
So, Christoph, what is the benefit of this from Object One? Because it does exactly the same thing as the constructor, right?
It's kind of for async, yes. It's async and kind of maybe parity after people learn that there are those static methods. They are not. They basically can now say, okay, from now on, I'm going for static methods all the time, and everything is there. Basically, the static methods. The philosophy, we actually discussed it on our team. The philosophy was static methods are the fully complete set of features that this thing has, and then some things are constructors. They are just helpers.
I have to say, like, at that point, I really wonder whether we wouldn't be better off if saying there are no constructors. Like, usability wise, I'm still somewhat convinced that if you have 0 constructors and everything is aesthetic, so long you are very consistent with your naming, I think it will be the same or better usability.
Yeah,
I understand the
trade-off. We could test it, but they are not the same.
Right, but I can understand where if you had, so all the ones that look like read-only span of byte, as constructors, and then everything else was frums. I can completely see people never noticing the frums on that one.
Yeah,
but it's when there's no nothing other than a default constructor, that's when I think that going back to the either all set extensions or static froms or whatever, like that immediately shows up as what should I do. Now, if it's a class and it has no public constructors at all and new is a syntax error, then they'll find the froms really quickly. You've forced them down one pattern. So.
Yeah, I also wonder whether that is something where we can actually help with an analyzer.
What would you analyze?
You would basically search for if people try to new up binary data and you're saying like, sorry, you need to use a factory method.
So an analyzer for code that doesn't compile?
Yeah.
I guess that's allowed.
I mean, it might sound weird, but I do believe that would be a useful thing, because you can, the problem is you can often induce what people want by just looking at what they did, right? And it's like, oh yeah, I see you have a new statement with binary data. That's not going to fly. You have to call it one of those from,
I've
methods.
never seen. I don't know what it means to make an analyzer that runs on code that doesn't compile, because I've only ever seen things looking at like the symbol model. And
it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Basically, the U-analyzer gets, so if something doesn't get bound, you actually get an error symbol. So like you can look at new statements, and the new statement is bound against the binary data type. It just doesn't find a constructor, right? And so you can totally do that relatively easily. The problem is more like, get two errors, right? Because the compiler will not shut up, right? It will still give you the error for binary data, so you have to make sure that your error message pops. But anyway, like I think it's just one thing we could explore. I think I don't know, like I think once people learn that everything is binary data from, everything is just so much more discoverable from that point on.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we ever do get extension statics, then it would just fit in with no penalty, right? It's just, it just shows up if you have the right usings. That seems very natural to me. And then the other problem that I have is with async. I fundamentally hate this. Oh, you want to do, now I take a stream that is actually not from memory, so now I want to make it async, and then you have to rewrite your code again, right? It seems like the constructor is leading people down almost the wrong path, because growing that thing is basically you have to delete the code and retype it with a static invocation, right? It seems unfortunate.
Yeah, I would really like that there be only one correct way of doing things, and so again, if we had a usability study that said that people absolutely totally fell on their face with this when it was no public constructors and or only a default constructor, and that they had to use sets or static froms, then I'm totally willing to look at the data. But from a conceptual thing, it does feel like the answer is, well, the constructors are here so that you find that you can use this type, but really we immediately want you to learn to call the froms, which effectively means we obsolete all the constructors so that you, or put the analyzer with a warning of like, you should really call this other thing instead. What you wrote compiles, we just don't like it. It's not idiomatic, and that feels weird.
Well, you said, but we don't want you to call the constructors. I wouldn't go that far.
Well,
people like the syntax, and I don't think people were confused that some things are helpers and they are constructors.
Yeah, the problem I think isn't that. I think the problem is more you're kind of boxing them. You're basically leading them to a room that you then immediately tell them like there's more to discover elsewhere, and then you have to you can't go from that room anymore. You have to basically step back to the root and then take a different path. That is the thing I don't like about it. Like, I think it's okay if you would say, there's simpler overloads and there's more complicated overloads. Those seem more like they're just more doors in the same room that you can see, but you never have to walk back. Do you know what I mean? Like, basically by saying, now, if you want to do async, well, you have to walk back. Instead of doing a constructor, you have to call a static method instead.
Yeah, but the thing is that since this thing is in-memory data, what is the reason to use async?
Well, I mean, if your stream is a network stream, then draining that stream is an async operation, right?
No, this thing doesn't serialize to streams.
No, when you
No, but you do have in the proposal. You have from. You have
Yeah,
a from
and
stream.
I'll tell you what this in the proposal what the async methods are for. They are so obscure scenario that like we kind of don't care that people don't discover those. And so I'll tell you what the scenario is. The scenario is that some serializers in the course of serialization they do IO. It's not that because basically we serialize to memory stream. So async is kind of not important. The thing is that there are some serializers that during the course of serialization, they do kind of side IO. An example would be Avro serializer that goes into schema registry and retrieves a schema. But those are so obscure scenarios that, you know, basically what we would be doing is to make it more consistent and make all obscure scenarios and extension methods and everything be the same, we would remove constructors, which we know is a bump.
Well,
it's not a fatal bump, but it's a bump.
But you're saying for serializers, but the one that just takes stream and is just draining the stream, that one is the async makes sense. Now the answer could be drop support for stream altogether.
What do you mean by stream? Binary data does not have constructors that take streams.
You have a from stream method that takes stream and from stream async.
From. Okay, yes.
And that stream is, if it's a file stream or a memory stream,
True.
If it's a file stream created by anybody who's not Jeremy Kuhn, it's a synchronous stream. And therefore it doesn't matter which one you call, but if the moment it's a network stream or a Jeremy Kuhn created file stream, then it might be actually asynchronous and doing actual asynchronous work. And now you may have left that one out of the constructor pattern because the synchronous one in stream is probably not the one you want. So that the mainline scenario on that one's async, and the sync one's there just for sync parity for async methods. But that one immediately has the, oh, I have a stream, I guess I have to drain it myself because I'm looking at the constructors. I don't realize there's a from that will do the work for me, and why can't it do the work for me, right? And it's like, well, it does, but we have these two patterns, one of which is 80% covering and the other's 100% covering, and you're in the 20%. Sorry. It just feels weird. Like, I don't know that we have too many types that have both constructors and static froms, unless it was we added the static from like 3 versions later and there was we needed a name because the signature was otherwise going to be the same. And so it feels like we generally do one or the other, and this one's doing both.
Yeah, I actually think that we have many of these that makes them, but it's possible that many of them.
I think we got there over time instead of got there from the get-go.
Yeah, to me I mean, again, like I have a hard time believing that people struggle entirely through static methods if there's only static methods, because I can't think of something, but we have a fuck ton of like properties at least where you don't ever new up the thing, right? Encoding comes to mind and other things like where that's the pattern you do things with. But yeah, I mean, I understand Crystal's argument.
People had to learn those types. So all the types that only have statics, people kind of had to learn them. So, you know, one of the reasons for the bump that people run into is that we have many types in the platform that literally cannot be instantiated. So it's not that, you know, if they try the constructor, discover that there is no constructors, they are like, okay, since there are no constructors, for sure there is a method to, you know, a static method. Then it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that people learn that there are many types you cannot instantiate them. You kind of have to use some other way. You know, they maybe are types that only are returned by something else. So non-trivial number of people would try to instantiate a type. If they cannot, they just give up and they just, okay, well, I have to somehow figure out, maybe it's returned from something else. Maybe it's an abstract class and they don't, you know, notice that it's not. And so it is a bump. And I I don't think that the reason to introduce the bump is strong enough. I mean, you know, like we are trying to get to 100% parity at the cost of having a bump.
I'm just like, I feel that we do. I don't think we have it written down anymore, but generally we have a don't have two ways of doing the same thing. At least, especially if you introduce them at the same time.
You're confusing .NET with Go.
Fair enough, but like I feel that we generally don't say that if you like this one syntax, we let you do it with this syntax, or if you like this other syntax, you can do it with this other syntax, and that we did work to do both. If it's just like syntactic sugar in the language, and then like for each versus using the interfaces directly, like sure.
We do that, right? But the way we usually think of these is not like alternatives to doing the exact same thing. We usually think of those as usability bridges, right? So for example, there really isn't a reason why you need to use the file.static APIs at all. You can just new up the correct thing. You can just new up a stream reader path in a path, right? And then do the thing yourself. They're meant to be accelerators, but the way these APIs are structured is that they also, by their signatures, tell you which types are involved, right? So they are, you have no idea how to open a file. Well, you probably look for file dot, and then you see a method, and then you see that gives you back a stream reader, and now you learned about stream reader, right? So like now you discover effectively the way you can do things, right? And that's kind of the same here. I mean, you could argue that the constructors are, you just expect constructors to be there, you find them, and then later on you say, there's other static methods on the same type that do more stuff. So you can sell this as a progressive framework, right? To me, what I don't like about these things is that, like, if there's effectively a choice to do A or B, to me, choices are effectively represented as either different methods or different overloads on the same thing. I think it's very weird if we have, things that are kind of orthogonal decisions like async versus non-async, but then your entry point into the technology completely changes based on that. That to me is the thing that rubs me the wrong way with this design. But like, I do think that having two ways of doing the same thing is beneficial if they are effectively just making common things super simple or expose them on like things you just happen to look for, right? So I wouldn't say we should only have one entry point per thing. That seems a bit too far. As Christoph said, that reminds me of Go, where...
That's fair, but I can see the analogy with file. Just generally that means that it's spread apart a little bit. Like file stream, you're thinking about stream, versus file, you're thinking about like, I have this file, I want to open it. And
right.
that those bridging types were more about the concept that you have was different when we sat down and thought about it.
I agree with that.
And here it's, I want to make a binary data. I can do it with the static or I can do it with the constructor. What's the difference? One of them uses the word new. And then, one of them also has async variants, right? And you're like, then why would I use the constructor? So.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think it's the same concept. It's just different mechanics to doing the same thing on the same concept does seem a bit redundant. I agree with that. Not only redundant, I think it literally it feels like you're leading you along the wrong path, right? It's like, I used the constructor, but then you're telling me it's actually the static I should probably be using. That seems odd.
Yeah, and so it's not. Again, I mean, I see the value in this thing, but the trouble is at the best value we have to pick some general rule and like look the other way, because we do have a lot of some decoupling things which are coming from like linker stuff. We have some. If you're having two different ways of doing it, the concept should be different as a vague general guideline, like that. Somewhere in here we have to pick which is the thing that we get the best usability for the least smell, right?
But Jeremy, the decoupling thing and some other things, I agree with you. I have to say that doing one way of doing things, that's literally not a .NET guideline. I would almost say the guideline is the opposite. Like we often have the design where there is a kind of very general and powerful way, and then we have helpers, and yes, they duplicate functionality, and we say, too bad. We select defaults, we add helpers, because we want to have both power and helpers that provide usability.
Right, but I think generally that's when you have a high level versus a low level thing, or it's file versus file stream, that one of them is about the noun that you're looking for and another one's about the technology that you're using to implement it. But having a static and a constructor on the same type just feels, to me, that feels, I understand we would do it for usability and discovery, but it feels like people couldn't make a decision and said, let's just ship both things. But there's no difference in concept. It's, I want to build a thing.
No. I'm not sure this is, so I agree. We don't want something that we cannot explain what's the reason, like, oh, we didn't have a reason. It's a, random mistake, or we didn't think through. Here, there's a reason. And the reason is everything is as a factory method, because that's the powerful API. And then things that are fully synchronous are constructor parameters.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I just feel that for almost any other type, if it came into API review, you even would say, why do you have both statics and constructors? Pick one. So, and yeah, I know the rule's not written down, and that's why I'm trying keep reformulating it. If it's just based on a gut feel of when people are like, what's the difference in these? Well, why do they look so similar without you having picked a model? Is just thoughts running through my head. But
so, by the way, I have to run, but I sent you guys the notepad text that I was typing.
Okay.
I honestly, so I don't know if there's an appetite for adding this abstraction, serialization abstraction, but I have to say, I just realized during this meeting that it solves the third-party extensibility problem. Otherwise, I mean, we explored many paths and they all are very speculative, depend on some compiler features, don't work super well. As we discovered, no serialization technology will actually want to add dependency on binary data probably for a very long time. So I think the abstraction is frankly the only trackable way to make it kind of out of band extensible.
Right. The problem with that is we can't modify the existing types to depend on a new base class in a way that works for net standard. So it would have to be, we'd have to come up with what the abstraction looks like and then put sibling types that are just wrappers that bridge between the new abstraction and the existing types, because we can't give nets or anything, especially that came out of .NET Framework. We can't introduce a new base class because now it's not compatible on the wire, or it's not compatible in memory.
I think that's probably true anyways, because even, I mean, ignore the versioning for a second, right? But like, it's very unlikely that an existing serializer happens to have the exact same signatures, right? So, and you don't want to expose both of them on the same type. Like, that seems, now you have a problem of like, okay, which thing are you actually meaning? Like, so I think realistically, almost every serializer will end up with whatever types they currently have, plus those wrapper types, right? And I think that's, and then, you know, given it's a different type, you can choose to ship them however you want. Yeah. But I think
this... By the way, we shipped actually JSON.NET implementation of the object serializer.
Yeah, and so I think that as building the stuff and building all the sidecar stuff, I think that there's much goodness in that. But I don't think you'll get it in 2 months.
Yeah, I think the object serializer, I think, given that this one seems like you already have it shipped, we know what the API shape is, I can probably spec that out relatively quickly, and we can convince ourselves that that is trivial. The problem is, I guess, more about the fact, you know, where do we ship the actual implementations for that we have to walk through. I think the JSON one we can probably ship with JSON itself, but then the question is who ships the object serializer, and it probably would have to be a separate package again, because yeah, you don't want to depend on JSON in order to get the abstraction. But like, I don't know, like, to me that this is one thing that I think is very tractable. To me, that there's still this bigger issue of like, how do we close on the design on this type? Because it seems like we talked a lot, but we still don't have really agreed upon API shape.
Well, so one additional thing. If we want to do the object serialization abstraction separately, As long as we have a design and we know what methods we would add, we don't need to do it on the same schedule. So that can be a very, a bit longer term path. Secondly, if we think that actual serializer abstractions serializers would not implement the abstraction, but rather there would be some, other package that kind of ties them together. In this case, this, serializer abstraction could be with the same package like the binary data.
Sure, but I guess my question is more along the lines of, so let's say we have, so let's for a second assume the object serializer is actually, a closed design, right? So assume for a second we already shipped that design, right? Or, it doesn't matter where it's shipped, but assume it's already there. Would this solve all the usability issues that binary data has? Because if I'm using protobuf, do you really want to go through like new binary data object, I don't know, new protobuf object serializer, blah, 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 because that's a lot of lines of code, right?
So first, one thing is you wouldn't, there's a serialization and deserialization. So deserialization would be super simple. Do we agree?
In the sense that they can already do extension methods on the instance, yes.
And serialization would be the following. It would look like this. Look, new my object. Okay, Seagull serializer, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, since we don't have that one yet, it could be the first thing that actually just directly implements is the extension. But if we went from, the existing system text JSON, or we were doing something for Newton soft JSON, then there would be some new object that they have to.
No. There wouldn't be any new object. So JSON. In fact, this is exactly what we have.
We'd have to make the type JSON object serializer that implements the abstraction and bridges to the existing serializer. That's all I was saying.
But we already established that will happen no matter what we do.
Right.
Okay, so I'm basically just illustrating to Emo. You don't have any like super ugly code with news and storing serializers and whatnot.
And the moment you wanted to configure it, you probably wanted to save it to a field somewhere, and you're just referencing the field.
Exactly.
But I do think I think that it will be a very, very, very hard sell to get a serialization abstraction that does not want T.
I
don't see that shipping while Jan still mans the helm of the CLR.
Well, to be fair,
I can also say things about me and Levi, but I can use Jan first. He's bulkier than I am.
I'm puzzled. I don't really understand how Jan thinks that serializers can be typed.
Well, in fairness, we have shipped APIs like that, though.
I like his goal. I mean, his goal is good goal. Like when things can be typed, they should be typed. Serializers, people literally, all serialization methods, look at the framework. They all take objects.
Except JSON serializer, which takes T.
Which one? The new one?
Yeah.
It doesn't have a method that takes object?
It has one that takes object, type. And you can pass type of object into that one.
Yeah, no. So totally.
Like in here, you gave no notion of the type of my obj, right? Somewhere in here, the T needs to be born. It's not going to be based on object. It's going to be based on a strong type somewhere instead of payload-based deserialization or.
Yeah, we have that. So that if you look at binary data today, it takes a type parameter because of
Right, and I think that we would instead build that into, you would have JSON object serializer of T.default, and that would be a pre-configured instance that knows about the type it's going to.
I'm just saying that's not how users use serializers.
Fair enough.
Like
I know they
store
want
T at compile time.
Yeah,
People basically serialize random object graphs, and they not gonna hard code a switch statement for all of those. Like they just want to keep passing objects to this serializer.
I know, and
Okay, then then I
and
don't know what.
James Forshaw really likes finding bugs in their code, so because dynamic deserialization is always.
I understand Jan's desire to weed out dynamic code. There are some things that are fundamentally dynamic, like serializers.
Yeah, I think.
Anyway, I'm just saying. I think that'll be the hard part of getting that discussion through, is figuring out what the abstraction looks like, to figure out where the T's come in, how much of this can be strongly typed so that you're not casting away from object again, how much of it is like, where can generic inference help you, where can generic return help you, etc., so that you're not doing back to .NET 1 of what type this is, but you have to write the cast anyway because there's no way to express it to the language.
I think the question then becomes like, I mean, again, we have shipped this recently with the extension methods, right? Because we said there are cases where you just don't know the type statically, and Jan was ultimately not happy, but he was okay with the design. So I don't think it will be a ship stopper. But I think the question now becomes if we do have that here, because it seems like your design only has object and type, right? Versus in the extension methods we had both. And so I'm not sure how much of this is a problem then, because it seems like with this design, effectively nothing is linkable because you always end up going through the object and type case. So effectively your hello world scenario using binary data is unlinkable. And I think that's a bigger problem.
So by the way, okay, I just typed the constructor that is untyped, but in fact binary data has methods of T.
Right, so
like two objects of T, because binary data is like, I completely acknowledge that's not a general purpose serialization scenario. I retrieve some payload, I kind of have to know what it is. Otherwise, I was more commenting on the serialization abstraction. When it's just a general purpose serialization, I do believe it needs to be untyped. You literally, I mean, sure, if we added of T, people would do what I think Eric was saying, which is just type object, pass object to T.
It's one option, but the other one, and like based on the feature that just got added of the spitting out new classes at compile time from a generated source thing.
Source generators, yeah.
Yeah, so with the source generators, it's if you're doing serialize of T, and let's just say that T is a sealed type, like it can literally not use the serializer at all and just write down, go write this stuff, go write this stuff, go write this stuff, go write this stuff. And so being able to have a notion of I'm doing serialize of T gives you a lot of power. Now, maybe it also needs the type or the object comma type. I'm just saying that's where the design and how do they flow and what are the, like, those are the things that are the, where I think it'll end up being like this, where we're 90 minutes over on a meeting already.
All right, I really need to run, but yeah, maybe there will be more, discussions. But as I said, the object serializer, I believe it can be added later. It's just basically a bunch of overloads.
Yeah, and as long as you end up in the case where the instance already knows what's going on, then yeah, stuff can work.
Yeah. All right.
So then action item for me is I will expand the spec to actually include the shipping variable. I will sketch the design that we just have, which seems like, based on what I heard, is we leave the constructors, we have the statics as well, and then we say like eventually we will have a serializer abstraction that we allow people to pass in the serialization format as an instance of object serializer. Is that where we're landing?
Yes.
So then we're not putting JSON in the name of the current methods, and they'll just be anachronistic eventually, or archaic.
You're saying not, or you saying we are, and then it will become.
I'm asking which way. Like, if we say to object from JSON, then it's obvious that it's JSON, and you don't have the like. Well, don't use the simplest overload because it's not the format you want. That one says it's JSON.
Yeah. So I would basically my philosophy, the approach here would be today it's JSON. Once people learn how it all works, and new serialization formats become popular, there's just a parameter that you control. It's fine, because basically the alternatives are impacting usability of a new type, and that one is more important than having to pass an enum value in the future. But my opinion, my 2 cents. But it's fine if Emo sketch both alternatives without defaulting to anything today and with defaulting. And we can compare and contrast.
Like, I think it would be fine to have an instance method to object from JSON. I just think having the format in it when there's no parameter telling you what it's otherwise doing is valuable. Also, it helps them.
Emo, so you're gonna sketch?
Yeah, I will. And
Right.
then I will send an update, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
All right, I need to run.
Sounds good.
Good discussion.
Yep.
Talk to you.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks online.